The night Liam Bennett saved a billion-dollar company, nobody saw it coming. Not the executives asleep in their penthouses, not the board members who never learned his name, and certainly not the managers who had spent 3 years making sure he stayed invisible. But the servers knew, the code knew. And deep inside a dying network at 2:47 in the morning, one exhausted man with grease-stained knuckles and a photo of his sick daughter taped to his monitor made a choice that would either save everything or cost him the only thing he had left. This is the story of what happens when loyalty meets its absolute limit. Stay with me until the end. Hit like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The photograph was held to the monitor with a single strip of masking tape that had started peeling at one corner. Liam had meant to replace it for weeks. A fresh piece of tape cost nothing. The 10 seconds it would take to press it back flat cost nothing either. But there was always something else. A failing relay to chase down. A network packet dropping somewhere in Sector 7. A supervisor standing behind him asking why the response time on Node 4 was 2 milliseconds slower than yesterday. So the tape kept peeling, and the photograph stayed crooked. In it, Emma was 6 years old and missing her 2 front teeth. She was standing in front of a fountain in Riverside Park, wearing a yellow raincoat that was 2 sizes too big because Liam had bought it on sale, thinking she'd grow into it faster than she did. She was laughing at something off camera, probably a pigeon. She'd always had an inexplicable love of pigeons. And her whole face was lit up in that specific way that only children's faces can be, with no performance in it, no awareness of the camera, just pure unfiltered joy leaking out of her. That photograph was the reason Liam came to work every night. Not the paycheck, though God knew he needed it. Not the title. Senior Infrastructure Technician Level 2. A label that had taken him 5 years to earn and which appeared nowhere in any company presentation, press release, or annual report. Not the health insurance, though that had become increasingly the most critical thing in his life over the past 8 months. It was the photograph. It was the reminder of what the night shifts were for. Liam Bennett was 32 years old, and he worked from 10 at night until 6 in the morning inside the server infrastructure division of Nexora Technologies, one of the 15 largest technology corporations in the country. He had worked there for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had called in sick 4 times. Once when he had a fever of 102 and Emma's school had already called him, once when Emma herself was hospitalized for the first time, and twice during the worst week of his life, which he did not think about if he could help it. The building where he worked was called the Nexora Operations Center, and it occupied the basement level and sub-basement level of Nexora's downtown headquarters, a 40-story glass tower that stabbed up into the Chicago skyline like a challenge. The executives worked up top, where the windows were floor to ceiling and you could see the lake on clear days. The engineers and technicians worked at ground level and below, where the windows were either frosted or didn't exist. Liam had never been above the 14th floor. He didn't mind the basement. He'd made peace with it years ago. The servers ran at a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant the room was always slightly too cold, and after 6 years his body had adjusted so that 68 degrees felt like the baseline of existence. When he went outside in summer and it was 90 degrees, it genuinely shocked him for a moment, like stepping into a foreign country. He had a workstation in the corner of the main monitoring room. Not a cubicle exactly, but a space that had gradually become his through a slow accumulation of personal objects. A coffee mug from Emma's school fundraiser. A small plastic dinosaur she'd given him as a good luck charm when he'd started the job, back when she was 1 year old and had no concept of jobs or luck or why her father kept leaving in the evenings. A worn paperback copy of a network architecture textbook he'd read so many times the spine had split and been repaired with electrical tape. And the photograph, held up by its slowly failing strip of masking tape. On the night that everything started to break, not just the servers, but the careful, exhausted equilibrium of Liam's entire life, he was 40 minutes into his shift when he noticed the first anomaly. It was a Tuesday in March. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in March, making everyone regret living there. Rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be snow, wind that had been building over the lake for 3 days and had arrived at the city in a state of personal grievance. Temperature sitting at that specific miserable number. 34 degrees. That was too warm for the ice to be pretty, and too cold for anything to be comfortable. Inside the operations center, it was 68 degrees and the servers hummed their constant mechanical hymn. 3 other technicians were on shift with Liam. Marcus, who was 26 and spent every slow moment playing chess on his phone. Diane, who was 44 and had been there longer than anyone and mostly communicated in sighs. And Joel, who was new and still at the stage where he asked questions about everything. Bennett, Marcus didn't look up from his phone. You're staring at screen 3 like it owes you money. Something's off with the allocation logs. How off? Liam leaned forward, pulling the keyboard toward him. Like someone's been quietly rerouting processing cycles off the main system and into a secondary partition I've never seen documented before. Marcus finally looked up. That's not normal off, that's weird off. I know. Diane turned from her own station. How long? I'm trying to figure that out. Liam pulled up the historical logs, scrolling backward. The data was dense, thousands of entries per hour. But he'd been reading these logs for 6 years and had developed a specific kind of pattern recognition that he couldn't fully explain, a feeling more than a thought. Like how a mechanic can hear an engine knock and know, before they've opened the hood, roughly where the problem lives. He scrolled back 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4. 63 days, he said finally, sitting back. The room was quiet for a moment except for the server hum. Someone's been quietly bleeding resources off the main infrastructure for 63 days, Liam said, and no one flagged it because they kept it just below the threshold that would trigger an automated alert. Joel, from across the room, that sounds like it would be hard to do by accident. It would be impossible to do by accident, Liam said. He didn't say the next part out loud, which was, this was done deliberately, by someone who understands the system well enough to hide things in it, and I don't know yet whether to be worried or terrified. Instead, he opened a new log file and started building a report. His direct supervisor was a man named Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt was 48 years old, had the build of someone who had once been athletic and hadn't quite made peace with no longer being so, and wore his company ID badge slightly higher on his chest than anyone else. A small detail that, in Liam's experience, told you a lot about a person. Dale had been Liam's supervisor for 3 years. In those 3 years, Dale had taken credit for Liam's work 4 times that Liam knew about, probably more that he didn't. The first time it happened, Liam had told himself it was a misunderstanding. The second time, he'd almost said something and then thought about Emma's medical bills and didn't. By the 4th time, he'd understood the arrangement clearly. He did the work, Dale received the recognition, and the payment for this arrangement was that Liam kept his job. It wasn't an agreement he'd signed or even consciously accepted. It was just the way things had become. He filed the anomaly report at 11:23 p.m. and sent it to Dale with a note that said the rerouting appeared intentional and warranted immediate escalation to senior infrastructure leadership. Dale's response came at 11:41 p.m. I'll take a look at this in the morning. In the meantime, don't discuss this with other team members or other departments. I'll handle it from here. Liam read the message twice. Then he looked at his anomaly report, 15 pages of documented evidence, and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the server room temperature. In the morning, as though this was the kind of thing you looked at in the morning. He typed back, Dale, with respect, I think this should be escalated tonight. The pattern suggests active interference with the Project Helix partition, and that's launching in 11 days. The response came faster this time. I said I'll handle it. Focus on your assigned tasks. Liam sat very still for a moment. Then he saved a copy of the anomaly report to his personal secure drive, closed the conversation, and went back to monitoring. But he didn't stop watching screen 3. And he kept the secondary partition logs open in a minimized window, checking them every 15 minutes, writing down what he saw in a notebook. A physical paper notebook, old-fashioned, something he'd started keeping because paper couldn't be remotely deleted. At 2:15 a.m., Emma called. She wasn't supposed to be awake. She was 7 years old, and it was 2:15 in the morning, and she had school the next day, and Liam had left specific instructions with Mrs. Kowalski, the neighbor who stayed over on his night shifts, that Emma was to be in bed by 9. Hey, Bug. He kept his voice low, stepping away from his workstation to the break room doorway. What are you doing up? I couldn't sleep. Her voice was small and raspy in the way it got when she was tired but fighting it. My chest felt tight again. The cold thing moved through him again, sharper this time. Tight how? Not bad tight, just there, like something sitting on it. Okay. He kept his voice steady. He was very good at keeping his voice steady for Emma. It was maybe the thing he was best at in the world. Did you use the inhaler? Yeah, it helped a little. Is Mrs. Kowalski awake? She's asleep on the couch. I didn't want to wake her up. Emma. He closed his eyes for a second, pressing them shut. If your chest feels tight, you wake Mrs. Kowalski up. That's the whole reason she's there. I know, but she snores and she looks really comfortable. Despite everything, he almost smiled. She looks comfortable. Yeah, like a big sleeping dog. Do not tell Mrs. Kowalski she looks like a sleeping dog. I'm not dumb, Dad. I know you're not. He exhaled. Listen to me. Go wake her up. Gently, okay? Tell her your chest is tight and you use the inhaler. She'll know what to do. And then you get back in bed, and if it gets worse or you feel scared, you call me immediately. You hear me? What if you're busy? I'm never too busy for you, ever. You call me. A pause. Then, quietly, okay. Good girl. I love you, Bug. Love you too, Dad. Sorry for calling. Don't ever be sorry for calling me. Good night. He hung up and stood in the doorway of the break room for a moment, staring at the wall. Emma's condition, a combination of pulmonary complications and an immune disorder the doctors had been characterizing and recharacterizing for 8 months, was not immediately life-threatening. 3 different specialists had told him this, carefully, in the language doctors use when they're trying to be reassuring without making promises they can't keep. What it was expensive, and progressive without consistent management, and the kind of thing that required flexibility. Appointments at odd hours, occasional emergency calls, days when he needed to be somewhere other than where he was scheduled to be. He'd asked Dale for schedule flexibility 6 weeks ago. The conversation had gone badly. It had been a Tuesday then, too, which Liam would later decide meant something, even if he couldn't say what. He'd requested a meeting with Dale and laid it out plainly. Emma's condition required weekly specialist appointments that fell on Wednesday afternoons, which overlapped with the mandatory team briefings Dale had recently instituted. He wasn't asking to miss the briefings permanently, just to either receive the materials afterward or participate remotely. Dale had listened with the specific expression of a man who had decided the answer before the question finished. The briefings are mandatory, Dale said. That's not a policy I made up. That comes from infrastructure leadership. I understand. I'm asking about accommodation for a documented medical situation. Are you filing a formal accommodation request? If that's what it takes, because if you file a formal request, that goes into HR, and HR flags everything that goes into it, and it becomes part of your personnel record. And when performance review season comes around, Dale spread his hands in a gesture that was supposed to look like helplessness, and instead looked like a threat wearing a shrug. Liam looked at him. I'm just being honest with you, Dale said. I'm trying to help you avoid a process that could complicate things. What you're describing sounds like retaliation for filing a protected request. Dale's expression flickered, something going cold behind his eyes. What I'm describing is the reality of how these things work. I'm on your side here, Liam, but I can only do so much. Liam had left the meeting with nothing resolved, and the clear understanding that Dale was not on his side, had never been on his side, and had just made it crisply plain what would happen if Liam tried to use the official channels the company theoretically provided for exactly this kind of situation. He'd missed 3 Wednesday briefings since then. Each one had been documented in his personnel file as an unauthorized absence. He'd received 2 written warnings, both signed by Dale, both phrased in the language of concern rather than punishment. The way a hand around someone's throat can be presented as an embrace if you tilt it just right. The specialist had told him 2 weeks ago that they needed to consider adjusting Emma's treatment protocol, which would require additional appointments and possibly a short surgical procedure. The estimate for the procedure, even with insurance, was $11,000. Liam had driven home from that appointment and sat in his parked car outside his building for 20 minutes before going inside. Project Helix was Nexora's flagship product, a distributed infrastructure management platform that had been in development for 4 years and was scheduled for its public demonstration in 11 days. Every major investor, tech journalist, and potential enterprise client the company had been cultivating would be in the room. The CEO had called it, in an all-hands meeting that Liam had watched via live stream on a laptop in the server room, the moment that defines the next decade of this company. Liam knew Project Helix better than almost anyone, because he had spent the last 14 months quietly troubleshooting the infrastructure problems that kept appearing in its underlying architecture, not the clean, elegant problems that made it into design documents. The actual problems, the kind that showed up at 3 a.m. and required someone who understood the system at a level below the level that the system's official documentation acknowledged. He'd found 17 critical vulnerabilities in 14 months. Fixed 16 of them. Written detailed reports on all 17. None of his reports had been escalated under his name. He'd found out 6 months ago that Dale had been forwarding them to the project architecture team with different cover emails, presenting the findings as originating from Dale's team review process rather than from any specific technician. Liam had said nothing about this. He'd written it down in his notebook. The 17th vulnerability, the one he hadn't been able to fully resolve, was in the load distribution protocol. Under normal operating conditions, it was invisible. But under the kind of concentrated demand that a live demonstration with simultaneous access from multiple enterprise-level clients would generate, it could cascade, badly. He'd flagged it 4 months ago. Dale had said he'd escalate it. Liam had never seen evidence that he had. Now sitting in the server room at 3 a.m., watching the secondary partition logs that no one was supposed to know about, Liam realized something that made his stomach drop. The resource rerouting he'd found wasn't random, it was targeted. Whoever had been quietly bleeding processing cycles off the main infrastructure for 63 days had been specifically weakening the load distribution protocol, the one already vulnerable component in the entire system. Someone was planning to make the demonstration fail, and they'd been preparing for 2 months. He picked up his notebook and started writing faster. He drove home at 6:15 a.m., through streets still quiet in the gray Chicago morning, rain-soaked and dull, and found Emma at the kitchen table eating cereal and reading a library book about ocean animals. "You're supposed to be getting ready for school," he said. "I am ready for school. I'm eating breakfast." She was wearing her school uniform, blue cardigan, white shirt, the gray pants she liked better than the skirt, and her hair was in 2 uneven braids that she'd clearly done herself. One was tighter than the other. She'd been practicing braiding for 2 months, with a patience he found both admirable and slightly heartbreaking because she'd started learning after Sophie's sister had visited and done her hair, and Emma had watched and decided she wanted to learn to do it herself. "How's your chest?" he asked, dropping his bag and going to the coffee maker. "Better. Mrs. Kowalski made me do the breathing exercises." She turned a page. "Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts?" "I did know that." "They also have blue blood." "Also knew that." "You're not even impressed." "I'm exhausted," he said, not unkindly. "Give me a minute to be a human being before I'm impressed by octopuses." She giggled, a small sound, but it landed in his chest like something warm. He filled his coffee mug, the one from the school fundraiser, and sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched her read. She had Sophie's nose and Sophie's way of going completely still when she was concentrating on something, like the world outside the page had ceased to exist. He didn't let himself look at her like this for very long, usually. It made something complicated happen in his chest that he didn't have the bandwidth to process on top of everything else. "Dad?" She looked up from her book. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, Bug, just tired." She looked at him for a moment with the specific, evaluative gaze of a child who is not entirely convinced. "You look like something's wrong. Work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." "I always worry about you when you look like that." "I know." He reached across the table and tugged one of her uneven braids gently. "I'm okay. The braids look good, by the way." She reached up and touched one. "They're lopsided." "You're getting better." "Mrs. Kowalski said they looked like snakes." "Mrs. Kowalski says a lot of things." He stood, drained the rest of his coffee. "Come on, I'll walk you to the bus stop." 8 days before the Helix demonstration, Dale Pruitt called Liam into his office. Liam had been expecting something like this. The anomaly report had gone quiet. No escalation, no follow-up, no acknowledgement beyond Dale's initial message telling him not to discuss it. For 8 days, Liam had continued to monitor the secondary partition logs privately, continued to watch the resource bleed accelerate, and continued to write everything down in his notebook. He'd also, carefully and without announcing it, begun to rebuild the load distribution protocol's most vulnerable subroutine from the ground up, working on it during slow hours of his shift, testing it against simulated high-demand conditions in an isolated environment he'd created himself on a secondary partition. If he could fix it before the demonstration, maybe the deliberate sabotage would be blunted. Maybe it would be enough. Maybe. He brought the notebook to Dale's office and sat across the desk from him. "I want to talk about your performance," Dale said. Liam waited. "Specifically, I'm concerned about some patterns I've been seeing." Dale opened a folder. 3 unauthorized absences in 6 weeks. 2 written warnings that don't seem to have produced any change in behavior. And now, he held up a printed copy of the anomaly report. "This. What about the anomaly report? I'm concerned about your methodology here. You accessed historical logs outside your assigned monitoring scope. You generated an unsanctioned report without clearance from this office. And you sent it in a way that could, if the wrong people saw it, create unnecessary alarm and damage the company's preparation for Helix." Liam looked at him. He kept his voice very flat and very even. "I found evidence of deliberate infrastructure tampering targeted at Project Helix. I filed a report about it. That's my job." "Your job is what I tell you it is." A beat of silence. "Okay," Liam said. "Then tell me what to do about 63 days of documented resource rerouting." "I'm handling it." "How?" Dale's jaw tightened. "That's not something you need to be involved in." "Dale?" Liam leaned forward slightly. "In 8 days, there's going to be a live demonstration of a system that someone has been quietly sabotaging for 2 months. I know what's going to happen when it goes live under full demand. I've been trying to fix the vulnerability, but I need access I don't currently have, and I need it now, not—" "This conversation is over." Dale closed the folder. "I'm issuing you a formal warning for insubordination, and I'm recommending to HR that we begin a performance review process, given the ongoing pattern of absences and boundary violations." The room was very quiet. "A performance review," Liam said. "It's standard procedure. 8 days before the demonstration. The timing is what it is." Liam stood up. He picked up his notebook. He looked at Dale Pruitt, at the company ID badge worn slightly too high, at the folder full of selectively assembled evidence, at the expression of a man who had never been afraid of anything because he'd never been in a position where he had anything to lose. "Okay," Liam said. "That's it? Okay?" "That's it." He walked out of the office and went back to his workstation and continued working on the load distribution subroutine. He worked on it for 4 more days, getting steadily closer, burning through the slow hours of his night shifts, drinking too much coffee, checking his phone every time it buzzed because Emma's chest had been tight 3 more times in the past week. 4 days before the demonstration, at 2:47 in the morning, Project Helix's infrastructure went critical. Not fully down, but close. The resource bleed had crossed a threshold, and the system had begun attempting to self-correct using automated protocols that were themselves compromised. It was the infrastructure equivalent of a body trying to stabilize itself and accidentally triggering the wrong response, like white blood cells attacking healthy tissue. Alarms went off. Real alarms this time. Not the quiet warnings that Liam had been watching in his private logs, but the full system alerts that would wake up every senior engineer in the department and put Dale Pruitt's phone into emergency notification mode. The monitoring room erupted into controlled chaos. Marcus was on his feet, hands moving across his keyboard. Diane was on the phone immediately, running through the emergency contact protocol. Joel was pulling up the system map with wide eyes. And Liam was already 3 levels deep into the diagnostic tree because he'd been watching the logs, because he'd known this was coming, because he'd spent 4 days building a tool specifically designed to address this exact failure mode. "Node cluster 7 is cascading," Marcus called out. "If it hits the Helix partition—" "I see it." Liam was already there. His rebuilt subroutine was sitting in an isolated environment, tested, ready. The question was whether he had clearance to deploy it to the live system. He picked up his phone and called Dale. 4 rings. 5. Voicemail. He called the on-call engineering director. 3 rings. A groggy, disoriented voice. What's happening? Node cluster 7 is cascading into the Helix partition. I have a patch ready, but I need authorization to deploy to the live system. Where's Pruitt? Not answering. A pause. The sound of someone sitting up in bed, trying to wake up fast enough. How confident are you in the patch? 4 days of isolated testing. I'm confident. If I'm wrong, the system goes down anyway, just slower. If I'm right, I stop the cascade before it hits Helix. Another pause. Then, do it. I'll document the authorization. Liam deployed the subroutine. For 93 seconds, he counted them. Nothing happened. The cascade continued its slide toward the Helix partition, and Liam sat completely still watching the numbers. And Marcus stood a few feet away, not breathing, and Diane had stopped her phone call, and Joel hadn't moved. Then the cascade slowed. Stopped. Reversed. The system began stabilizing in a way that Liam had never seen it do before, because it had never had this subroutine before, because the subroutine fixed something that had been broken since the system was built. Not just the crisis of tonight, but the underlying structural weakness that the saboteurs had been exploiting for 63 days. Within 11 minutes, the Helix partition was stable. Within 20, the entire system was running at normal parameters. Diane exhaled. It sounded like a building settling. What did you just do? Marcus said quietly. Fixed it. That patch, where did that... I've been working on it. Liam pushed back from his workstation. His hands, he noticed, were shaking slightly. He hadn't noticed them shaking while he was working. I'm going to document what happened and file a full incident report. Bennett. Diane was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Good work. He looked at her. In 4 years of working alongside Diane, she had never said that to him. Thanks, he said. Dale Pruitt arrived at the operations center at 9 the next morning, 3 hours after Liam's shift had ended, but while Liam was still there, finishing his incident report. He had not slept. He had gone to the break room at 6 a.m., made a terrible cup of vending machine coffee, and continued writing. Dale walked into the monitoring room, looked at the status board showing a fully stable system, and then looked at Liam. My office, he said. Liam saved his work, brought his notebook, went. You deployed an unsanctioned patch to the live system, Dale said. I deployed an authorized patch. The on-call engineering director authorized it verbally. It's documented. You went around this office to obtain authorization. You weren't answering your phone during a critical system emergency. The correct protocol when a supervisor is unavailable is to contact the next level of authority, which is what I did. Liam put the notebook on the desk. Dale, I just saved the Helix demonstration, and the system, by the way. The subroutine I wrote doesn't just patch the crisis that happened last night. It fixes the structural vulnerability that the saboteurs have been exploiting for 2 months. There's no evidence of sabotage. There was a system malfunction. I have 63 days of log data showing deliberate, targeted resource rerouting by an authenticated user account. I have it documented, time-stamped, and backed up in 3 places. He held Dale's gaze. I'm filing that as part of the incident report, along with the timeline showing when I first reported it and what happened to that report. Dale stared at him. Something was happening behind his eyes. The calculations of a man who has always been able to control the information, who has just been told that the information has already left the building. You're making a serious mistake, Dale said. Questioning the integrity of this department's management? I'm writing an incident report. That's my job. Liam stood. Is there anything else? Yes. Dale's voice had gone flat, the warmth drained out of it entirely, like a light being switched off. I'm suspending you pending a full review, unauthorized system access, insubordination, and violation of communication protocols. For a long moment, Liam just looked at him. In that moment, he thought about Emma's braids, lopsided and imperfect, and how she'd been practicing. He thought about the photograph with the peeling tape. He thought about Sophie, not the end of Sophie, which he never let himself think about if he could help it, but the beginning. The Sophie who used to fill notebooks with equations and ideas, who had been more brilliant than anyone in any room she ever walked into, and who had never been properly recognized for it either. He thought about $11,000 and Wednesday appointments and breathing exercises, and a small voice on the phone at 2 a.m. saying, "My chest feels tight." He thought about what it meant to keep making himself smaller, to survive inside a space that had never intended to accommodate him. "No," he said. Dale blinked. "No what?" "No, there's nothing else. I'm not suspended. I quit." A beat of silence. I'm resigning, effective now." He picked up his notebook. "I'll clear my workstation." He walked out of Dale Pruitt's office for the last time, went back to the monitoring room, peeled the photograph off his monitor, gently, carefully, taking the strip of masking tape with it, and put it in his bag alongside the notebook. Marcus watched him without saying anything. Diane looked at her screen. Joel opened his mouth and then closed it. Liam picked up the coffee mug from the school fundraiser, the plastic dinosaur, the paperback with the electrical taped spine. He walked out of the Nexora Operations Center, up the service stairs, and out into the gray Chicago morning. The wind off the lake hit him like a wall. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment, bag over his shoulder, photograph in his pocket, 32 years old and unemployed for the first time in 6 years, with $11,000 of medical expenses and a 7-year-old daughter waiting at home. He stood there long enough that a woman walking past glanced at him with the specific eyes of a Chicagoan assessing whether someone needs help. He didn't need help. He needed about 30 seconds to stop his hands from shaking again. Then he started walking toward the parking structure where he'd left his car, and he didn't look back at the glass tower. And he made himself think only about Emma, about the uneven braids and the octopus book and the yellow raincoat 2 sizes too big, because that was the only thought that could make the next step feel possible. He had walked away. He didn't know yet that walking away was the thing that would force the truth into the light. He didn't know that in 6 days, the woman who ran the company from a glass office 40 stories above, where he'd spent the last 6 years of his life, was about to come looking for him. He just walked. 1 step, then another. The wind came off the lake and the city was gray and enormous around him, indifferent as cities always are. And Liam Bennett, the man who had fixed a billion-dollar system without anyone watching, disappeared into the morning crowd, carrying a photograph, a dinosaur, and a notebook full of everything they'd tried to bury. The company didn't fall apart the day Liam left. That would have been too clean, too immediate, too easy to trace back to a single cause. Instead, it started unraveling the way most things do, quietly, in the places no one was watching, until the damage was too large to hide with a memo. For the first 2 days after his resignation, nobody in senior leadership knew Liam Bennett had ever existed. This was not unusual. The executive floor of Nexora Technologies operated in a world so thoroughly separated from the server rooms below that they might as well have been different companies sharing a mailing address. Victoria Sinclair ran a billion-dollar corporation. She gave keynote speeches and met with senators and had her photograph taken at industry conferences. She did not know the names of the people who kept the infrastructure running at 3 a.m. She would learn later that this was a failure she was responsible for. But that was later. On the 3rd day after Liam walked out, what she knew was this. Project Helix was showing instability readings that her infrastructure team couldn't explain. The demonstration was 3 days away, and every engineer she'd put in front of her in the last 6 hours had given her a different answer about why the numbers looked the way they looked. Victoria Sinclair was 30 years old, and she had been CEO of Nexora Technologies for 14 months. She had not inherited the position. She'd clawed her way into it through a combination of intelligence, 18-hour days, and the specific kind of ruthlessness that gets called decisiveness in men and something else entirely in women. She knew this, had made a kind of cold peace with it, and kept moving. She was not by nature someone who panicked, but she was also not someone who accepted "we're working on it" as an answer when working on it didn't seem to be producing results. She was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office on the 40th floor, 40 stories above the street where Liam had stood shaking 3 days earlier, when her chief of staff knocked and opened the door. "Tell me something useful," she said without turning around. Her chief of staff was a woman named Rachel Park, 34, precise, and allergic to wasted words, which was the primary reason Victoria kept her. "The infrastructure team can't replicate the stability from the night of the incident," Rachel said. "They understand the patch that was deployed, but they're not fully certain they understand how it works, or whether it'll hold under live demonstration conditions." Victoria turned from the window. "Who deployed the patch?" "That's where it gets complicated." Rachel brought her tablet forward. The on-call authorization was given to a senior technician named Liam Bennett, but Bennett resigned 3 days ago, the same morning. He fixed the system and then quit? More accurately, he fixed the system, got called into his supervisor's office, and then quit. Victoria looked at her. "Who's his supervisor?" "Dale Pruitt, head of infrastructure operations." "Get me the full incident report, and get me Bennett's personnel file." Rachel hesitated. A small pause, barely half a second, but Victoria noticed everything. "Pruitt's office has flagged the incident report as under internal review. They're saying it contains unverified claims that could affect the department's integrity if circulated." The phrasing landed like a stone in still water. Victoria registered the ripples. "Pull the raw logs," she said. "The original system logs from the night of the incident, not the departmental write-up, and get me the security footage from the operations center." "Security footage? If this man fixed my flagship system in the middle of the night 3 days before the most important product demonstration this company has ever attempted, and then walked out the door the next morning, I want to know exactly what happened in that building, from the beginning." Rachel left. Victoria went back to the window. 40 stories below, the city moved in its usual pattern. Taxis and pedestrians and the 8 a.m. crowd pushing through the cold. She'd looked at this view so many times that she'd stopped seeing it, but right now she was seeing it differently, thinking about what she didn't know about the world below her. Thinking about how many things happened in the basement of her own company that never made it to the 40th floor. It took Rachel's team 6 hours to pull everything together, and what they brought back to Victoria that afternoon changed the shape of the afternoon entirely. She sat at her conference table and went through it methodically. The security footage first, then the raw logs, then the incident report that Liam had written in the break room between 6 and 9 a.m. on what turned out to be his last morning in the building. She read slowly, which was not how she usually read. She was a fast reader, absorbed information in chunks, processed it efficiently, moved on. But she read Liam's incident report slowly, twice, because it was the kind of document that deserved to be read that way. It was precise and thorough and written without a single trace of self-pity, which, given what it described, she found remarkable. Then she watched the security footage from the night of the incident, 40 minutes of it. The timestamp in the corner ticking from 2:47 a.m. to 3:27 a.m., while one man at a workstation in the corner of the monitoring room did something that her 3 best current infrastructure engineers had spent the last 2 days struggling to fully reverse engineer. When she finished, she sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her head of HR. "I need the complete personnel file for Liam Bennett. Everything. And I need an explanation for why this man had 2 written warnings in his file in the 6 weeks before he resigned." The explanation, when it came, made her put the phone down and look at the ceiling. She pulled Pruitt's personnel file next. Then she pulled the personnel files of the 2 other managers whose names appeared in Liam's incident report as having access to the secondary partition logs. She had Rachel cross-reference the authentication records in the infrastructure system against those names, checking access logs going back 90 days. At 8:47 p.m., Rachel knocked on her office door again. She had the look of someone who has found something they didn't want to find. "2 of the names from Liam's report," Rachel said. "They have authenticated access to the secondary partition, and their access logs show irregular activity going back 61 days. Repeated access to the resource allocation controls, small adjustments each time." 61 days, Victoria said. Bennett documented 63. The 2-day discrepancy probably accounts for the time it took him to trace the pattern back to its origin point. So he was right. He appears to have been right about everything in that report. Victoria stood up. She'd been sitting for 3 hours. She walked to the window again. Not because the view gave her anything, but because she needed to move, and the window was the farthest point in the office from the desk. She stood there looking at the city, which was dark now, lit up in the way cities are at night, all those windows and all those lives inside them. "Where does he live?" she asked. Rachel looked up from her tablet. "Sorry? Bennett, do we have an address?" "We have his last address on file from HR." A pause. "You're thinking of going to see him?" "I'm going to see him." "Victoria." Rachel set the tablet down, which was the physical gesture she used when she was about to say something that wasn't purely logistical. If Pruitt finds out you're personally reaching out to a resigned employee whose incident report is currently being suppressed, Pruitt is going to have much larger problems than whether I made a house call. Victoria picked up her coat from the back of her chair. "I'll be back in 2 hours." She took the elevator down 40 stories, the whole way, no stops, and walked out through the lobby into the cold night air, and did not tell her driver where she was going until she was already in the car. Liam's apartment was in Logan Square, 20 minutes from the building. It was a 3-story walk-up on a quiet street, brick-faced, old enough that the intercom panel in the lobby had clearly been replaced 3 times and still didn't work properly. She buzzed apartment 2C twice before a voice came through the crackling speaker. "Yeah. Mr. Bennett, my name is Victoria Sinclair. I'm the CEO of Nexora Technologies. I know this is unexpected, and I understand if you tell me to leave, but I'd like to talk to you." A very long pause. "Are you actually here? Like, outside?" "Yes." Another pause, then the door buzzed open. She walked up 1 flight of stairs. The stairwell smelled like old wood and someone's cooking, something with garlic and onion, and found him standing in his doorway at the end of the hall. He was wearing jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, barefoot, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not surprised, exactly. More like someone who has been expecting a knock and isn't sure yet whether the person on the other side is going to be good news or bad. "You're Victoria Sinclair," he said. "I am. I've seen you on the live streams, the all-hands meetings." He looked at her for another second. "You look different in person." "Smaller, probably." "I was going to say more tired." It was so bluntly honest that it startled a small, genuine laugh out of her. She hadn't laughed at anything in about 48 hours. "Can I come in?" He stepped back from the doorway. The apartment was small. Living room, kitchen visible through an archway, a hallway leading back to what she assumed were bedrooms. It was not a particularly decorated space, but it was not a careless one either. Books stacked on a shelf that needed another shelf. A child's drawings pinned to the wall above the radiator, a whole row of them rendered in crayon with the specific confident wrongness of a young child's art. People with heads too big for their bodies, a sun with eyes, what appeared to be an octopus with 10 legs, a pair of small sneakers by the front door, pink with Velcro straps. On the kitchen table, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle, a library book about marine biology open face down, and 2 mugs, one adult-sized and one child-sized with a cartoon fish on it. "Your daughter," she said. It wasn't a question. "She's asleep." He stood in the middle of the room with his arms crossed, not aggressive, but not at ease. "It's 9:30. School night. I won't be long." She looked at him directly. "I've spent the last 8 hours going through the security footage, the raw system logs, your incident report, and the authentication records you referenced. You were right. About all of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay. The resource rerouting was deliberate. 2 of the managers named in your report have access logs that support everything you documented. Dale Pruitt appears to have suppressed your initial escalation and then initiated a retaliation process when you continued pursuing it. I know what happened. I was there." She held his gaze. "Yes, you were." She paused. "What I'm trying to say is that I know what happened now too, and I'm sorry it took until after you left for anyone above Pruitt's level to find out." He looked at the wall of Emma's drawings for a moment. She watched him do it, watched the thing that moved through his expression. Not anger, exactly, or not only anger. Fatigue, maybe. The particular kind that comes from being right for a long time in a place where being right didn't help you. "What do you want?" he said. "You didn't come here to apologize." "I came here to ask you to come back." He turned to look at her with an expression that said, with absolute clarity, that he had expected her to say something different. To what? He said. To the same situation with a different supervisor? A written apology in my file? Because if that's... No. She sat down, not at the kitchen table, which felt like taking too much space, but on the arm of the couch near the door. She'd come here to talk, not to take up room. I'm talking about coming back with real changes, real authority over the infrastructure you've been maintaining, real recognition of your work, protection for you and your daughter. Protection. The word came out flat. Emma's medical needs. I've looked at your benefits file. The current plan doesn't adequately cover what she needs. I want to fix that. Something crossed his face then. A complicated thing she couldn't fully read, some combination of suspicion and something more raw beneath it that he pulled back quickly, like a hand from a hot surface. Why? He said. Why does fixing it matter to you? You didn't know her name 2 days ago. You didn't know mine. She could have given him a corporate answer. She had about 6 of them ready. Instead, she sat on the arm of his couch at 9:30 at night in a building that smelled like someone's cooking and said the true thing. Because I run this company, and what happened inside it is mine to own. And because I watched 6 hours of documentation of a man holding up the infrastructure of a billion-dollar system while being systematically undermined by people who understood that no one above them was paying attention. That's on me as much as it's on them. Liam was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear faintly something from down the hall. The small sounds of a child in sleep, the shift and settling of a small person in a bed. There are conditions, he said finally. Tell me. Everything I documented in the incident report gets investigated. Not internally reviewed, actually investigated by someone who doesn't report to Pruitt or anyone in his chain. Agreed. My wife's work. He stopped, recalibrated. Sophie. Her name was Sophie Bennett. She was an engineer. Before she died, she spent 3 years developing the foundational concepts that Nexora's distributed architecture is built on. Her name is nowhere in the documentation. She was never compensated or credited. Victoria went very still. I have her notebooks, Liam said. Her development journals. Time-stamped. She shared the concepts with 2 people at Nexora before the company formalized the architecture. One of them is still employed there. I can prove what she contributed. For a moment, the apartment was completely silent. Then Victoria said, very quietly, How long have you been sitting on that? Since I figured it out, about 2 years ago. He looked at her steadily. I didn't say anything because I needed the job, and because I didn't trust anyone above Dale to care. A pause. I'm trusting you now, which I realize is a significant gamble. She looked at him for a long moment. At the barefoot engineer in the faded sweatshirt in the small apartment with the child's drawings on the wall, who had just placed something enormous and irretrievable on the table between them, in the full knowledge of how badly it could go. It's not a gamble, she said. And she meant it, in the way that she meant very few things completely. I want to be clear. I can't promise you everything is going to be easy. What you're describing, what you've documented, it's going to make a lot of powerful people inside and outside this company very uncomfortable. There are going to be people who fight back. I know. And the demonstration is in 3 days. I need you back before that happens. He looked at her for a long time. I need to think about it, he said. Tonight. She nodded and stood. That's fair. She moved toward the door and then paused because there was something she hadn't said yet and needed to. The patch you wrote. The subroutine you deployed that night. My engineers have been trying to fully map it for 2 days. One of them told me this afternoon that it doesn't just fix the vulnerability that was being exploited. It makes the architecture fundamentally more efficient. The load distribution at live scale is going to perform at levels we weren't projecting to hit for another 18 months. He looked at her. You built that in 4 days, she said, in the middle of night shifts, while you were being formally reprimanded. She shook her head, not for performance, but because the thing genuinely required a head shake. I'm not going to pretend I was going to say anything other than that I'm sorry we didn't know what we had. She left before he could respond, which she did on purpose, because some things land better when there's no one there to deflect them. She rode back to the Nexora building in the car, and in the back seat she called Rachel and said, Clear my morning. I need 2 hours with the board before anyone else tomorrow. Then she hung up and watched the city go past the window and thought about Sophie Bennett, a woman she'd never met, who had apparently built the foundation of the company Victoria had spent 14 months running and whose name was on nothing. At 11:47 p.m., her phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number which she only recognized when she read it. 3 conditions, all of them in writing before I walk back through the door. The investigation, Sophie's recognition, and Emma's coverage. All 3. She wrote back, all 3, in writing, tomorrow morning. A pause. Then, okay. She set the phone down and for a moment allowed herself to close her eyes, which was the closest she came, in those days, to rest. She thought about what Liam had said. You look more tired in person, and thought about how true it was, and how long she'd been tired, and how rarely anyone said it out loud. She did not sleep well that night. She spent most of it at her desk, working through what the next 3 days would require, making a list in her head of every conversation she needed to have, and every document she needed to sign, and every person she needed to look at directly and say, this ends now. She was good at her job. She was excellent at her job. But she was 30 years old, and she had been running this company for 14 months, and she had a painful awareness that being good at running a company and being good at seeing the people inside it were not automatically the same skill. She was trying to learn the difference. The next morning at 7 a.m., before the board meeting, before Rachel arrived, before the building fully woke up, she went down to the 14th floor and then kept going. Down to the operations center, down to the server room where the systems ran at 68 degrees, down to the workstation in the corner where a masking tape mark on the monitor frame was the only evidence that someone had been there at all. She stood in the server room alone for a few minutes. The hum of the machines was different down here than the quiet of the 40th floor, constant, functional, indifferent to anything above it. These machines ran regardless of what happened in the glass offices. They ran because people like Liam showed up at 10 at night and kept them running. She went back upstairs and sent the contracts to his email at 7:23 a.m., before she sat down with the board, before she did anything else. He signed them at 7:51. She was in the middle of a sentence to her board chair when her phone lit up with the confirmation, and she finished her sentence, but she felt it. A small release of something she hadn't realized she'd been holding, like a knot in a rope finally giving way. He was coming back, but they both understood without saying it directly that the thing he was walking back into was not the same thing he'd walked out of. The saboteurs were still inside the building. She hadn't moved yet on Pruitt or the others, because moving too fast would give them time to destroy evidence. The demonstration was still 3 days away. The conspiracy her own managers had been running was still only partially mapped, its edges unclear, its full reach unknown. The mess was still entirely a mess. She went through the board meeting thinking about all of it. The 3 conditions in writing, Sophie's notebooks, the authentication logs, the 63 days of careful, invisible sabotage. And when the board chair asked her if she was confident in the Helix demonstration, she said yes without hesitation. Not because she was certain it would go smoothly, because she now knew who was going to be standing at the controls. And for the first time in 3 days, that felt like enough. Liam showed up at the operations center the next morning at 9:30. Not his usual night shift time, but she'd asked him to come in during the day for the first 2 days so they could work through what the demonstration required without Dale Pruitt knowing he was back in the building until the investigation had progressed far enough to move on Pruitt formally. It was, she recognized, not a comfortable arrangement. She was asking Liam to be in the building without Pruitt knowing, which required a specific kind of discretion that put Liam in a professionally exposed position, and she knew it. When she went down to meet him in the operations center, he was already at his old workstation, the one in the corner. He'd plugged in a laptop she didn't recognize, personal, she assumed, and had the system diagnostic tree up on the monitor. He didn't look up when she came in. The staging environment has 3 cascading issues that weren't there when I left, he said, by way of greeting. Someone's been in the load balancer settings. We think one of the other involved parties made additional changes after you left, before we could isolate their access. How much damage? That's what I need you to tell me. He looked up at her then. He looked marginally less exhausted than he had the night before. He'd slept at least, though maybe not much. He was wearing the same kind of thing, jeans and a plain shirt, with the company lanyard she'd had Rachel prepare hanging from his front pocket, which listed his new title, Director of Infrastructure Integrity. She'd chosen the title herself. She'd wanted something that said, plainly, that his job was to tell the truth about how the system worked. He glanced down at the lanyard. That's not a title that was in the org chart 2 days ago. It wasn't in the org chart 2 days ago. Is Dale going to see it? Dale is going to have significantly larger concerns than your job title by the end of the week. Something moved through his expression. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down in a moment, even if the moment hasn't arrived yet. Okay, he said. He turned back to the monitor. Ceci, give me 4 hours with the staging environment and I'll tell you where we stand for the demonstration. She left him to it. But she didn't go back up to 40. She stayed on the floor below, in a conference room she'd commandeered for the next 3 days, working through the investigation materials with Rachel and the outside legal team she'd brought in. Every hour or so, she'd walk down to the operations center and check in. And every time she did, the picture on Liam's diagnostic screen looked slightly less alarming than it had the hour before. At one point, she walked in to find him on the phone, voice low, half turned away from the door. She caught enough to understand it was Emma. Something about dinner, something about a homework project on ecosystems, something that made him say quietly, "Yes, you have to eat the broccoli bug. That is non-negotiable." She stepped back out to the hallway to give him the moment, and she stood there in the hallway outside the server room, listening to the muffled sound of a father negotiating broccoli consumption with his 7-year-old, and found herself thinking about something she hadn't thought about in a long time. What it meant to have a life that existed outside the walls of an office building, where the things that mattered were dinner and homework and broccoli and whether the braids were lopsided. She'd told herself for 14 months that she didn't have room for that kind of life, that running a company at 30 required a specific kind of total commitment, and that everything else was what came later, after. She stood in the hallway and thought, for the first time in a long time, that she was not sure she believed that anymore. But that was a thought for later. Right now, the demonstration was in 3 days. The saboteurs were still operational inside her own building, and she had a board to manage and a conspiracy to dismantle and a product launch to save. She straightened up, went back into the conference room, and got back to work. The 4 hours Liam had asked for turned into 11. Nobody complained about this because by hour 6, it was clear that the staging environment was in significantly worse shape than anyone had reported. And by hour 9, it was clear that Liam was the only person in the building who fully understood the scope of what had been done to it. Rachel brought him coffee at some point, a real cup, not the vending machine version, and set it beside his keyboard without saying anything. He drank it without looking up. Victoria came back down at 7 in the evening to find him surrounded by 3 monitors, all running different diagnostic streams simultaneously, a paper notebook open beside the keyboard with handwritten notes she couldn't read from the doorway. The overhead lights in the operations center had clicked over to their evening setting, slightly dimmer, and in the reduced light the screens cast a bluish glow across his face that made him look like he was submerged in something. "Where are we?" she asked. "They got into the configuration files," he said. "Not just the load balancer. Someone with authenticated access went into the base configuration of the Helix staging environment and made 37 small changes across 18 different files over the last 4 days. Nothing individually catastrophic. Collectively." He stopped. "You know how you can tune a piano so that each individual key sounds almost right, but when you play them together, the whole thing sounds wrong." "Yes?" "That." She pulled a chair over and sat down. "Can you fix it?" "I've already fixed 22 of the 37. The remaining 15 are in the core routing protocol, and fixing them without breaking the work I did the other night requires going very slowly." He looked at her. "How many hours until the demonstration?" 61. "Then I need 50 of them." "You need to sleep at some point." "I need to sleep at some point," he agreed, in a tone that suggested this was a theoretical concern that would be addressed theoretically. She sat with him for a while, not doing anything useful. She didn't have the technical vocabulary to contribute to what he was doing, but being there in the way that sometimes matters even when you can't explain why. She answered emails on her phone. She read through the legal team's preliminary findings on the authentication records, which were getting increasingly damning. At one point he asked her, without looking up, whether Nexora used an external vendor for its authentication logging backup. And she texted Rachel, and Rachel came back with a yes and a vendor name, and Liam nodded and made a note in the paper notebook. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking whoever did this was careful, but not careful enough. They cleaned their tracks in the primary system, but if the authentication vendor keeps independent backups, there will be a complete record that nobody inside this building can alter." She looked at him. "You thought of that?" "I thought of it 3 weeks ago, actually, before I quit." He turned a page in the notebook. "I filed a records preservation request with the vendor directly, as an individual, not through the company. Wasn't sure if it would hold." She stared at him for a moment. "You filed a third-party records preservation request on your own while you were still employed here." "I was trying to make sure the evidence survived regardless of what happened to me." He said it the way someone says something completely obvious, without drama. I'd been watching Dale make things disappear for 2 years. I wasn't going to hand him another chance to do it. Victoria did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the notebook stacked at the edge of his workstation. This one and at least 2 others she could see, the covers worn, the spines cracked. The accumulated documentation of a man who had understood, probably before she did, that the only thing protecting him was the paper trail he kept himself. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "The documentation." "Since about 8 months into working under Dale." He kept typing. He took credit for a network optimization I'd spent 6 weeks developing, presented it to the infrastructure director as his own team's work. I got a generic "good work this quarter" email and a 2% raise. He got a departmental commendation. He paused. After that, I started writing things down. She thought about the 47th floor, about the commendation that lived in Dale Pruitt's personnel file. She'd read it that morning. About the network optimization that had reduced the company's server costs by roughly $340,000 annually, which the commendation credited to Pruitt's team initiative. "I'm sorry," she said. It was the second time she'd said it to him, and it landed differently than the first time now that she understood more precisely what she was apologizing for. He glanced at her sideways. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You didn't know. That's different from not caring." He turned back to the screen. "The people who knew and didn't care, that's a different conversation." She understood that she was being let off one particular hook, and she was not entirely sure she deserved to be let off it, and she filed that uncertainty away to examine later. At 10 p.m., she made him stop. He argued for approximately 4 minutes, not loudly, but with the persistent focus of someone who had been in the middle of a problem and didn't trust themselves to find their way back to it after a break. She overrode him. "You'll make mistakes if you don't stop. Go home, sleep, be back at 7. He looked at her for a second with the expression of a person calculating whether the argument is worth having, and then apparently decided it wasn't. He saved his work in 3 places. She noticed this: the triple redundancy, the reflex of a man who had lost things before and didn't plan to lose them again, and shut down the monitors. She walked with him to the elevator, which was not something she had planned to do. They stood waiting for it in the corridor, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which itself was a slightly surprising thing. "The notebooks," she said as the elevator arrived. "Sophie's notebooks. You said you have them." He held the elevator door. "Yeah." "Can I see them?" "Not for the investigation specifically. I just want to—" She stopped, reformulated. "I want to understand what she built." He looked at her with something that was neither fully trust nor fully its absence, somewhere in the measured middle where most true things live. "I'll bring them tomorrow," he said. The doors closed, and she stood in the corridor and thought about a woman she'd never met, and a set of notebooks that had apparently been sitting in a Logan Square apartment for years, holding the unacknowledged foundation of a billion-dollar product, and how that was the kind of thing that should be impossible in a well-run company, and how it had happened anyway, inside hers, and how she had not known. She took the stairs back up to 40. She needed to move. She needed to do something with the specific restlessness that came from understanding the full shape of a problem for the first time, when the shape is bigger and stranger than you'd prepared for. The notebooks arrived the next morning in a canvas bag that had a small cartoon whale on it, which Liam set on the conference room table with the expression of a man who was aware that a canvas bag with a cartoon whale was not the most dignified vessel for what was inside it. Emma picked the bag, he said. It's a good whale. She's very committed to ocean animals right now. Victoria unzipped the bag. Inside were 4 notebooks, composition books, the black and white marbled kind, the same type she'd used in college for notes she didn't want to lose. They were filled, every page, with a handwriting that was small and dense and slightly left-tilted, interspersed with diagrams, flowcharts, equations she could follow some of but not all of. She'd been an economics major, then business school. The specific mathematical language of distributed systems architecture was not her fluent tongue, but she could follow the thinking. The shape of the ideas came through even when the technical notation went over her head, and the shape was extraordinary, recursive, elegant, built with a logic that folded back on itself in ways that felt inevitable once you saw them, the kind of ideas that make you think, of course it works this way, and then immediately wonder why you'd ever thought otherwise. She was working on this before she joined Nexora? Victoria asked, turning a page carefully. She'd been developing the core concepts for 2 years before she took a consulting contract with the company. The contract was supposed to be for 6 months. Liam sat across the table, hands flat on the surface. She was brought in to assess the feasibility of a specific architecture problem they were stuck on. She solved it in 3 weeks. Then she identified 4 related problems they hadn't noticed yet and solved 2 of those before the contract ended. And the other 2? Are in those notebooks. He nodded at the books in her hands. The concepts that she didn't have time to fully formalize before he stopped, looked at the table, before she died. Victoria looked at him. She had read the HR file, which listed Sophie Bennett's death as occurring 3 years and 2 months ago, because listed as a pulmonary embolism at age 28, which was a fact so brutal in its plainness, 28 years old, blood clot gone, that she'd had to set the file down for a moment when she read it. Was she sick? Victoria asked. Did she know? No. His voice was flat, but not cold. It was the flatness of something that had been processed through such sustained weight that it had compressed into something dense and quiet. No one knew. She had a headache for 2 days. We thought it was stress. She'd been working a lot. She went to sleep on a Wednesday night and didn't wake up. He picked at the edge of the table, a small, unconscious gesture. Emma was 4 months old. Victoria said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that, and she'd learned over 30 years that the impulse to fill unbearable silence with words was a kindness extended to the speaker, not the listener. After a moment, Liam said, the company used her concepts to build the Helix architecture. 2 of the people she'd worked with during her contract were on the architecture team when they formalized the design. Her ideas were in there, restructured, rephrased, attributed to the internal team. If you know what you're looking at, he touched the top notebook lightly. You can trace it. The timestamps in these are all dated. The Nexora internal development documentation was written after. I'll have the legal team work with an independent technical expert, someone with no prior relationship with Nexora. I already have someone, he said, an old professor of Sophie's from her graduate program. She's been a technical consultant for patent cases for 15 years. I reached out to her 6 months ago, just to understand if what I was seeing was what I thought I was seeing. Victoria looked up. And? She said it was. He met her eyes. She's prepared to provide a formal assessment if needed. There was a particular quality to this. The fact that he'd been quietly, methodically building this case for months, in the same way he'd built the incident report, in the same way he'd filed the records preservation request, in the same way he'd documented Dale's behavior in physical notebooks that couldn't be remotely deleted. Not out of calculation, she thought, but out of a kind of disciplined grief. A refusal to let what Sophie had built disappear the way Sophie herself had, without acknowledgement, without a record, without anyone outside of one person who loved her knowing it had existed. Okay, Victoria said. She closed the top notebook carefully and set it back in the whale bag. We'll do this right. All of it. Liam nodded once. Then he stood up. I need to get back to the configuration files. I've got 7 more to work through before tonight. He walked out of the conference room, and Victoria sat alone for a moment with the canvas bag on the table in front of her, and then she pulled the top notebook back out and kept reading. By that evening, 3 things happened more or less simultaneously. Liam finished correcting the 37 configuration changes and ran the first clean full system test of the Helix staging environment, which performed within acceptable parameters for the first time in 11 days. The outside legal team came back with authentication records from the third-party vendor, which confirmed Liam's documentation with a completeness that left very little interpretive room. And Victoria's director of corporate security, who'd been quietly investigating the individuals named in Liam's report, brought her a piece of information she had not been expecting. She took the security director's call at 7:15, standing in the corridor outside the conference room, while through the window she could see Rachel organizing documents into stacks with the focused energy of a person who was running on caffeine and righteous indignation. What is it? Victoria said. We've identified a communication thread between 2 of the internal parties and an external contact, the security director said. He was a careful man, methodical, not given to overstating things, which was why she paid attention when he continued. The external contact works for Meridian Systems. Meridian Systems was Nexora's primary competitor. They were scheduled to launch their own distributed infrastructure platform in 6 months, 6 months after Helix's demonstration, which would make Helix the market-establishing product and Meridian's launch a response rather than a competition. Unless Helix failed publicly. Unless the demonstration collapsed in front of every investor and journalist and enterprise client the company had assembled, in which case Meridian's platform would launch into a market where the conversation around distributed infrastructure was dominated by Nexora's failure rather than Nexora's success. How long has the communication thread been active? Victoria asked. 81 days. 81 days. Liam had documented 63 days of infrastructure tampering. The conspiracy had been organized for 18 days before the tampering began. I need everything, she said. Every communication, every contact point, every financial trail if there is one. And I need it locked down. Nothing goes outside this investigation team. She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at nothing, processing the shape of it. This had not been a few disgruntled managers cutting corners or taking shortcuts. It had been a coordinated operation, planned and funded from outside the company, executed through people who had access and motivation and specific technical knowledge of Nexora's vulnerabilities. People who had known, 18 days before anyone else, that Liam's vulnerability report was going to be ignored, which meant someone had told them about it. She went back into the conference room and sat down across from Rachel. I need you to pull Dale Pruitt's personal financial records, everything we can legally access, and I need you to do it tonight. Rachel looked at her with the expression of a person who has been waiting for this specific instruction and is simultaneously unsurprised and troubled by its arrival. You think he was being paid? I think I need to know whether he was. Rachel started typing before Victoria finished the sentence. She didn't tell Liam about Meridian that night. She wanted to have more complete information before she added that layer to everything he was already carrying. He left the operations center at 11:30, having spent 14 hours there, and she watched him go and thought that he moved like someone who was tired all the way through. Not just physically, but at some deeper level, the accumulated tiredness of years of carrying something heavy through a space that kept making it heavier. The next morning, the morning before the demonstration, was when the Pruitt situation broke open. Rachel came to her office at 6:45 a.m. with Dale Pruitt's financial records and a face that said the records had told a story she'd been hoping they wouldn't tell. Victoria looked through them in 20 minutes. She was a fast reader when she needed to be, and then she called corporate security and legal simultaneously and told them to prepare for a formal removal. Do we have enough? The head of legal asked. We have enough, Victoria said, and we'll have more when the vendor's full backup is processed. But what we have right now is enough to act. She went to Dale Pruitt's office at 8 a.m. She brought the head of legal and the head of corporate security and a written notice of termination that her legal team had drafted the night before, which was thorough in the specific way that documents are when they are meant to ensure that the person receiving them has no legal recourse to dispute what is happening. Pruitt was at his desk when she walked in. He looked at the group of people with her and understood, instantly and completely, what was happening. He'd always been a person who understood power and its movements. He just hadn't, this time, correctly predicted where the movement would go. "You found him," he said. "We didn't need to find him. He found us." She set the termination notice on his desk. "You have an hour to collect personal belongings under security escort. Your system access has already been revoked as of 6:30 this morning. We'll be in touch through legal counsel for the remainder of the process." He looked at the notice. He looked at her. He made one attempt at the thing he'd always done, which was to reframe the situation in the language of reasonableness. "Victoria, there's a version of this conversation where we handle this quietly, without... There's no version of this conversation that goes any differently than it's going right now," she said. "Take your hour." She walked out before he could find another angle. The two other internal parties, both mid-level managers who had been identified in the authentication records, were handled separately before 9 a.m. One of them, a man named Gareth Cole, who had been at the company for 7 years, looked at the documentation in front of him and went very pale and said, "I want to call a lawyer." The second, a woman named Kim Park, who was no relation to Rachel, started crying, which Victoria neither hardened herself against nor responded to with anything other than the legal notice and the security escort. It was not pleasant. It was not supposed to be pleasant. It was necessary. By 10 a.m., all three had been removed from the building. By 10:30, Victoria had called a brief, carefully worded all-staff meeting for the departments involved, informing them that a compliance matter had resulted in several personnel changes and that the investigation was ongoing, and that they should direct any related questions to the legal department. She did not mention Liam. She did not mention Sophie. She did not mention Meridian. She went back down to the operations center at 11 and found Liam already there, which meant he'd come in before the removal happened and had known something was occurring from the movement of security through the building without being told what it was. He looked at her when she walked in with the particular expression of someone working very hard to appear only mildly interested. "Pruitt's gone," she said. He looked at his screen for a moment. Then, "The others?" "Handled." He nodded. He turned back to his screen. He ran a diagnostic command and they both watched the results populate across the monitor. Clean, this time, every node in the expected range. "How does it look?" she asked. "It looks like it's going to work." He said it without celebration, just assessment. "The demonstration should hold. I need 4 more hours today to run final stress tests on the routing protocol, and then..." He stopped. She waited. "There's something I found this morning," he said, "while I was running baseline checks." He pulled up a window she didn't recognize, a communication log, flagged in a system she hadn't been told about. Someone was monitoring the internal investigation, someone who still has active system access. He pointed at a specific entry in the log. "This access point. It's not one of the 3 you just removed." She looked at the entry. It was an authentication token she didn't recognize, accessing a read-only monitoring tool that gave visibility into the internal communication channels the legal team had been using for the investigation. Someone inside the building had been watching the investigation unfold, reporting its progress, to someone outside. "How long?" she said. 6 days, starting from the day before your team pulled the raw logs." He looked at her. "Someone knew you were looking, before you found anything." The implications settled over the room like weather changing. "Who has access to this authentication type?" she asked. "Senior infrastructure personnel and..." He checked the access permissions. "Executive level, 2 authorization tiers." He looked at her carefully. "It's not someone from the technical team. The access profile is executive level credentialing." She looked at the log. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the authentication profile and thought about who at Nixora had executive-level access, and who among those people had known that an investigation was beginning, and who among those people had a reason to want it to fail. "Can you trace it?" she asked. "I've been tracing it for 2 hours," he said. "I have 3 possible source accounts. I need about 6 more hours and access to the executive authentication registry to narrow it down to 1. She gave him the access before she'd finished processing what she was agreeing to. He was already typing the request before she'd put her authorization code in. "I need to ask you something," she said. He waited. "When you found Sophie's contributions in the architecture, when you understood what the company had done or failed to do, did you ever think about going public, taking it outside?" She paused. "You had enough to do real damage to Nixora's reputation." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it genuinely rather than deflecting. "Yeah," he said. "I thought about it." "What stopped you?" He turned in his chair slightly, not fully toward her, but enough. "A few things. Emma first. If I burn the company down, I lose the health coverage and I lose the income, in that order of importance." He stopped. "But also, Sophie cared about the work. She was proud of what she'd helped build. She wouldn't have wanted me to destroy the thing she built." He turned back to the screen. "She would have wanted her name on it. That's different from destroying it." She looked at him for a long moment. At the side of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he spoke about Sophie in the present conditional tense without seeming to notice. She would have wanted. She was proud. She wouldn't have. As though the fact of Sophie's absence was real and accepted, and also irrelevant to the question of what Sophie would think. "We're going to put her name on it," Victoria said. "Officially. In the documentation, the launch materials, and the company record. We're working with our legal team on establishing a formal attribution. And after the demonstration, once this is stable, I want to talk to you about something more substantial, a foundation, something with her name on it that funds the kind of work she was doing." He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. "You don't have to do that. The attribution is enough." "It's not enough. It's a start." She moved toward the door. "Run your stress tests. I'll be in the conference room." She was halfway down the corridor when she heard his voice behind her. "Victoria." She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the operations center, barefoot again, she noticed, because he'd taken his shoes off at some point during the long hours at the workstation, a detail so small and human it had no business landing the way it did. "Yeah," she said. He looked at her for a second. "Thank you for—" He gestured vaguely at the building around them, at the thing that had happened over the past several days, the whole improbable weight of it. "Just, thank you." She held his gaze for a moment. "Don't thank me for doing what should have been done 3 years ago," she said. But she said it without bite. Just fact. He nodded once, went back inside. She stood in the corridor a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back to the conference room and called her board chair, and told him that the Helix demonstration was going forward as scheduled, that the internal compliance matter had been resolved at the personnel level, that an external investigation involving Meridian Systems was being referred to the company's outside legal team, and that the person who had fixed the system and saved the demonstration was a man named Liam Bennett, and she intended to ensure that fact appeared clearly and permanently in the company record. The board chair was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've had a busy week." "Yes." "Is the system ready for tomorrow?" She thought about the clean diagnostic screens, the corrected configurations, the rebuilt subroutine that had made the load distribution architecture fundamentally better than it had ever been. "It's ready," she said, and thought for the second time in as many days that having the right person at the controls made all the difference between those two words meaning something and meaning nothing. That evening, she did something she hadn't done in 14 months of running Nixora Technologies. She left the building before 8 p.m. She didn't tell Rachel why. She stopped at a Thai place 2 blocks from the office and ate at a table by herself, without her phone in her hand, without reviewing any documents. Just food and the ambient noise of a restaurant and the specific relief of being a person for 25 minutes rather than a CEO. She thought about the demonstration tomorrow. She thought about the executive authentication account she hadn't identified yet, still somewhere in the building, still watching. She thought about Sophie Bennett's handwriting in the composition notebooks, small and dense and left tilted. She thought about Liam standing in his apartment doorway in the faded sweatshirt, looking at her like a person trying to figure out whether the thing in front of him was going to help or hurt, and extending a kind of careful, conditional trust that she understood, at a gut level, was not something he extended easily or without cost. She thought about how that trust worked like an obligation, how she intended to be worth it. The demonstration was in 14 hours. She paid her bill and went back to the office. The morning of the demonstration arrived the way important mornings tend to, unremarkably, without fanfare, with the same gray Chicago light coming through the same windows, the city indifferent as ever to whatever human crisis was scheduled to unfold inside it. Liam was at his workstation by 6:15. Victoria arrived at 6:40 and found him already 3 diagnostics deep, coffee going cold beside the keyboard, a fresh page of the paper notebook covered in handwriting she was starting to recognize the shape of, even when she couldn't read it from across the room. He'd clearly been home. He was wearing different clothes than yesterday, but she'd have bet he hadn't slept more than 4 hours. Final stress test results, he said without preamble. The routing protocol held at 140% of projected demonstration load. I pushed it to 160 just to see, and it held there too. 160. The subroutine overperforms under sustained pressure. I don't fully understand why yet. I think it's something in the way the load redistribution interacts with the... He stopped. You don't need the technical explanation. I don't need it, but I'd like it eventually. He glanced at her, briefly surprised. Okay. She set her coffee down at the adjacent workstation. The executive authentication account. Did you narrow it down? His expression shifted, something pulling inward. 2 candidates, he said. I can tell you which of the 2 it is, but I need you to understand what you're looking at when I do. Tell me. He turned his second monitor toward her. The authentication log was up, and beside it a personnel profile she recognized before she finished reading the name. Richard Voss, Nexora's chief operating officer, a man who had been with the company for 11 years, who sat 2 seats from her at the board table, who had given a speech at the all-hands meeting 6 weeks ago about integrity and corporate culture that she remembered thinking was one of the better speeches she'd heard at a company event. She looked at the log. She looked at the profile. She looked at the timestamp showing Richard Voss's executive credentials accessing the internal investigation communications 12 times over 6 days, between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., the hours when he would have been certain she wasn't in the building. You're sure, she said. The access pattern matches his behavioral profile in the system, the times, the duration, the specific functions accessed. And he pulled up a second window. 3 of his after-hours access events correspond within 20 minutes to communication spikes in the external channel to Meridian. Someone was reading your investigation updates and reporting them within the same evening. She sat down. Not because she needed to. She was not the kind of person who sat down from shock. But because she needed a moment to recalibrate, and sitting was the physical form of that. Richard Voss. 11 years. He'd been COO when she was hired. He'd been her first internal ally, the person who'd walked her through the company's operational structure in her first month, who'd told her which relationships mattered and which battles weren't worth fighting. She'd trusted him with the preliminary investigation findings. She'd shown him the vendor authentication records. She'd told him about Liam. He knew I went to see you, she said, more to herself than to Liam. If he was monitoring the internal channels from day 1 of the investigation, yes. And he's connected to Meridian. Financially, I'd guess, the legal team will have to establish that. But the communication pattern is clear. Liam paused. There's something else. She waited. Last night, after you left, there was a new access event, not to the investigation files this time. He accessed the demonstration system's administrative controls, specifically the external network gateway settings. Liam pulled up the log. He changed one parameter. 1. In a place so deep in the admin tree that the automated monitoring wouldn't flag it as unusual. She looked at the parameter. It meant nothing to her technically. What does it do? Under normal demonstration conditions, nothing. But if the presentation environment gets hit with a specific pattern of external traffic requests during the live demonstration, the kind of traffic that would look like legitimate investor access at first, it would trigger a controlled failure. Not catastrophic, not obvious sabotage. It would look like a performance issue, the kind that makes a room full of investors and journalists think the system isn't ready for enterprise scale. He looked at her steadily. It would look like we overpromised. The demonstration was in 5 hours. Victoria picked up her phone. The next 40 minutes were the most compressed 40 minutes she could remember in 14 months of compressed moments. She called corporate security first, then outside legal, then her board chair. Not Voss's phone, obviously, not Voss's anything. And she laid it out in the flat, precise language she used when emotion was a luxury she was setting aside. Richard Voss. The authentication records. The parameter change. The Meridian connection. She gave them the log files that Liam transferred to her phone while she was on the first call, and she told them what she needed done before 9 a.m. She also told Liam to reverse the parameter change. He'd already started. By 8 a.m., Richard Voss had been met at the building entrance by corporate security and the head of outside legal and escorted to a conference room on the 30th floor. Not his floor, not the executive floor, a neutral space, where he was informed that his access had been suspended and that the conversation he was about to have was going to go better for him if he chose to participate in it honestly. Victoria did not attend that meeting. She had a demonstration to run. She sat in the operations center with Liam and Rachel and two outside technical consultants she'd brought in as independent monitors, and she watched the final pre-demonstration checks run, and she thought, with the part of her brain that was not currently managing 6 simultaneous crises, that this was the strangest week she had ever experienced in a professional context, and that strange was possibly the wrong word for it, and she couldn't immediately locate the right one. "We're clean," Liam said at 8:47. "Every parameter, the gateway is back to baseline, routing protocol is nominal, Helix is ready." She exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. She'd been doing this long enough to not perform her relief. But it was real. "Okay, let's go upstairs." He looked at her. "You want me to? I want you at the main control station during the demonstration. You know this system better than anyone in this building. If something unexpected happens, I won't be able to respond from a conference room 2 floors away." "No, you won't." He thought about it for a second. Then he saved his work. 3 places, the reflex she'd stopped noticing because it had become familiar, and stood up. The demonstration was scheduled for the 40th floor conference suite, which had been converted over the past week into a presentation space that could accommodate 60 people comfortably, and did so with the specific, expensive aesthetic that Nexora's events team applied to anything investor-facing. Clean lines, subtle branding, screens that cost more than Liam's car. The 60 people included institutional investors, enterprise clients from 4 industry sectors, 12 technology journalists, and 3 members of the State Economic Development Board. Liam walked in and looked at the room and then looked at the technical setup. The monitor cluster at the control station positioned to the left of the main presentation area, the cables running cleanly beneath the floor panels, the integration between the presentation layer and the live system beneath it. He went directly to the control station and started checking things, and the events coordinator, who had spent 3 weeks making every cable invisible, watched him pull up a floor panel to check a connection and made a small noise of distress but did not intervene, possibly because something in Liam's manner made it clear that intervening would not go well. Victoria watched this from across the room while talking to the board chair, who had arrived at 7 and was managing the board's collective awareness of the morning's events, with the practiced calm of a man who had been through several corporate crises and understood that the primary job right now was to not let the room know that anything had been wrong. At 9:50, the guests began arriving. At 10, Victoria opened the demonstration with the kind of composed, confident address she was genuinely good at. Not perform confidence, but the real kind, grounded in the fact that she'd spent the past 4 days learning, more thoroughly than she'd ever intended, exactly what was under the hood of the system she was about to present. She spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about distributed architecture and enterprise scalability and the specific problems Helix was designed to solve. She talked about performance projections. She did not talk about the week she'd had. She introduced the live system test, simultaneous access simulation from 6 enterprise environments, running at a load that was intended to demonstrate real-world performance, and nodded at the technical team and watched the screens come alive. From the control station, Liam watched different screens than the audience was watching. He watched the infrastructure, the actual numbers, the actual load distribution, the actual behavior of the system in real time. He watched the routing protocol handle the incoming demand, The load redistribution running exactly as the subroutine was designed to run it, clean and efficient and better than anything the system had done before he'd rebuilt it. For 11 minutes, everything worked. Then his phone buzzed. He looked down at it. It was an unknown number. Not a contact, not a saved name, a raw number with a Chicago area code. The message was 4 words and a photograph. The 4 words were, "Step away," or else. The photograph was Emma. She was sitting at a table he didn't recognize, in a room he didn't recognize, still in her school uniform, the blue cardigan, the white shirt, with her backpack on the chair beside her. She was not visibly hurt. She was looking at something off to the side of the camera, not at the lens, which meant she didn't know the photograph was being taken, which meant she didn't know something was wrong, which meant she'd been taken from school. This morning. During the demonstration window, when he was here and Mrs. Kowalski had gone home and Emma was supposed to be safe in a building full of teachers and other children, the room around him continued its demonstration. 60 people watching a screen. Victoria's voice, steady and authoritative, describing what they were seeing in the data. Liam sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then he typed back, "Who are you?" The response came in under a minute. "People who need you to walk away from that system right now. Kill the demonstration. System error. You know how to do it. You have 3 minutes." He looked at the screens. The system was running at full capacity, handling the load, performing exactly as it should. 60 investors and journalists watching it work. Victoria's voice. He looked at the photograph of Emma, sitting at that table, unaware. He stood up from the control station, walked directly across the room to where Victoria was standing near the main presentation screens, and stepped into her peripheral vision. She glanced at him, a quick read, the kind she was good at, and saw his face, and finished her current sentence and turned slightly toward him, creating a small natural gap in the presentation's flow. "I need 30 seconds, he said, very quietly. She looked at him for 1 second. Then she turned back to the room and said smoothly, "While our technical team does a real-time parameter check, which is part of what makes this a genuine live demonstration rather than a rehearsed one, I'd like to take a moment to discuss the enterprise integration model." She started talking. He pulled her 3 steps to the left, out of the primary sight line. He showed her the phone. She looked at the photograph. He watched her understand it. Fast, complete, the color of her expression shifting without her face actually moving, which was a specific kind of control he didn't have and recognized in her with something close to relief. "Emma's school," he said. "Someone took her." "When?" "Has to be this morning, before 9. Is she... She looks unhurt in the photo. They want me to kill the demonstration. System error." She looked at the screens, she looked at the phone, she looked at him. "Don't touch the system," she said. "Emma, I know." Her voice was barely above a breath. "Do not touch the system. Give me 90 seconds." She walked back to the center of the room and picked up the thread of her presentation so smoothly that no one in the audience appeared to notice the interruption. He watched her do it and understood, with a specific and unexpected clarity, that she was handling 60 people in a room while simultaneously thinking about Emma, while simultaneously doing whatever she was doing with her phone held at her side, screen angled away from the audience. He looked at his own phone. A new message. 2 minutes. He typed, "I need proof she's safe." 30 seconds. Then a short video, 10 seconds. Emma at the table, moving. She was alive and conscious and apparently okay, turning a page of something she was reading, oblivious. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the sides of his thighs and made himself think in systems rather than feelings, which was the only thing available to him that resembled functional thought right now. They had her. The photo and video had metadata. Not much. Phones were good at stripping metadata now, but there were other things. Background details. The table was institutional, the kind of cheap laminate table that appeared in offices and community centers and the back rooms of commercial spaces. The light was fluorescent. There was a window in the upper left corner of the frame, partially visible, showing what looked like a parking structure across the street. He opened the camera app and zoomed the photograph on his phone, looking at the window. Concrete columns, a specific angle of light. The kind of parking structure built in a specific era. Pre-2000, the column proportions were wrong for modern construction. and on the edge of the visible exterior wall, partially cut off by the frame, a sign he could see two letters of, an R and a partial curve that could be an O or a C. Victoria appeared at his elbow. Corporate security is mobilizing. I've also called the outside investigative firm we've been using. They have people 2 blocks from this building. The photograph, he said. Look at the window. She looked. Parking structure. Pre-2000 construction. There's a partial sign. R something. She took the phone and looked more closely, then sent the image to someone. He could see her typing a forwarding message, without asking his permission, which was fine. He'd have done the same. My security team has people who do this. Image analysis, location identification. I've sent it. 1 minute on their timer. I know. She looked at him. Do not kill the system. Victoria, if they hurt her, they won't hurt her while she's leverage. She said it with a precision that was brutal in its clarity. She's only valuable to them unharmed. The moment you do what they want, she stops being leverage. She held his gaze. I know that's a terrible thing to think about, but it's true. He looked at the screens, the system running clean, the room full of people who had no idea. His phone buzzed. Time's up. Last chance. He typed back, I want to talk to her. A pause. Longer than the previous ones. Then, you have 30 seconds. The call came through. He answered it before the first ring finished. Dad? Emma's voice. Small, confused, but not crying. Hey, Bug. His voice came out level. He had no idea how. Are you okay? I'm okay. These people said you know them, and there was a family emergency, and they picked me up from school, but a hesitation that told him she was old enough to feel that something was wrong, even without knowing what. But you always come yourself, or Mrs. Kowalski. I know. Emma, listen to me. You're okay. I'm going to come get you very soon. Are you in a room by yourself? There's 2 men outside the door. They gave me a granola bar. A granola bar. He wanted to put his fist through something. Are you scared? A pause. A very Emma pause. The pause of a child calculating whether to be honest or to protect a parent. A little. That's okay. It's okay to be scared. He turned away from the room, facing the wall, dropping his voice further. Emma, I need you to do something for me. Can you look around the room and tell me anything you see? Anything out the window? He could hear her moving slightly, looking. There's a parking garage, and a sign that says Ronan. Like, I think it's a building name. Ronan something, I can't see the rest. Ronan. He repeated it to Victoria, who was standing close enough to hear. She was typing before he finished the word. Good girl, he said. You're doing so well. I'm going to get you, okay? Very soon. The line went dead. Someone had ended it on their end. He turned to Victoria. Ronan Business Center, she said. It's 6 blocks from here, partially vacated commercial building. 3 floors of office space, 2 tenants on the ground level, upper floors empty. She was reading from her phone. My security team has a unit 4 minutes out. I'm going. Liam, I'm going. He said it without volume or heat, just absolute certainty. You have the system. You know the architecture well enough to call me if something goes wrong. The demonstration runs itself from here. He was already moving toward the door. Call me the second your security team has eyes on the building. She looked at him for 1 moment. She was going to argue. He could see it, the calculation happening. And then she didn't. Take Marcus, she said. He's on the floor below. He knows the building's neighborhood. He used to... But Liam was already in the hallway, already on his phone calling Marcus, already moving toward the elevator with the specific momentum of a person who has resolved all internal debate and is now simply executing. Marcus met him at the elevator bank with his coat half on and the expression of a man who had been told approximately nothing and understood from Liam's face that asking questions was a secondary priority. They went down together, through the lobby, out into the cold. 6 blocks in Chicago in March, moving fast, was about 4 minutes. They did it in 3. Victoria's security team was pulling up to the Ronan Business Center's side entrance as they arrived. 2 vehicles, 4 people in civilian clothes, who moved with the specific efficiency that told you immediately they were not regular security guards. The lead, A woman named Torres, who introduced herself in about 6 words, had the building's layout on a tablet. "Third floor," she said. "We've got visual confirmation through the parking structure's exterior cameras. 2 individuals, 1 minor, room 312. The individuals are armed." "Armed," Marcus said. "Handguns. Holstered. They're not expecting direct contact, but their communication pattern suggests they expected the target to comply and this to be over by now." Torres looked at Liam. "You're the father?" "Yes." "Then stay behind my team until we have the room secured. I understand if you don't, but I'm telling you it's better if you do." He understood the logic. He also understood that he was not going to stay behind anyone's team when Emma was in a room at the end of a hallway. He made no promises. They went in through the side entrance, up the stairwell. Concrete, fluorescent, the smell of a building that had been slowly emptying out for years. 3rd floor. Corridor with numbered doors, most of them dark, the overhead lights flickering slightly. Room 312 was at the far end. Torres signaled her team. 2 moved ahead. Liam watched them move with the controlled precision of people who had done this before, and made himself stay 2 steps behind rather than the 0 steps behind every instinct in his body was demanding. At 3 to 12, Torres's team stacked on either side of the door. A knock. 3 rapid official knocks. A shout identifying themselves as private security acting in coordination with law enforcement. A pause of 4 seconds. Then, from inside, a voice. "Back off, Will." Torres's team went through the door. What happened in the next 45 seconds was loud and disorienting and ended with both individuals face down on the industrial carpet, hands secured, neither of them having managed to reach the holstered weapons. Torres's team was good at their job. Liam walked through the door. Emma was in the corner of the room, standing on a chair. She'd gotten up on the chair when the noise started, which was such a specifically Emma response to threat that he felt something break open in his chest just looking at it. She had her backpack held in front of her like a shield, which would not have stopped anything but suggested a readiness to try. When she saw him, she dropped the backpack. "Dad?" He crossed the room in 4 steps, and she came off the chair into his arms, and he caught her and held her and said nothing, because there was nothing in the English language adequate to the particular quality of relief that flooded through him in that moment. The relief of holding something you'd been terrified of losing, which is its own specific and devastating kind of feeling. She didn't cry. She pressed her face into his shoulder and made a small, tight sound, and then she was very still, the way she went still when she was overwhelmed and didn't want anyone to see it. He felt her breathe, in, out, the chest expanding and contracting, the evidence of her being present and intact and safe, and he kept his arms around her and his hand on the back of her head, and he breathed too. After a moment, she said, muffled by his shoulder, "They gave me a granola bar. It was the peanut butter kind." "I don't like peanut butter." "I know you don't." "I told them I didn't like it. They didn't care." "We'll get you a better snack. Come on." He stood up with her, and she wrapped her legs around him like she hadn't done in about 2 years. Too old for it, she'd declared, at 5. And had maintained that declaration until now, apparently. And he carried her out of room 312 and down the corridor, and she didn't ask him to put her down. Marcus was waiting at the stairwell entrance. He looked at the 2 of them and blew out a breath and said, "Okay. Okay, good." Then he pulled out his phone and said, "I have to call Victoria." "I'll call her," Liam said. She picked up before the first ring finished, the same way he had an hour ago. "I have her," he said. A silence of maybe 2 seconds. Then, "Is she okay?" "She's okay. She's with me." He heard something at the other end. Not words, just the sound of a person releasing a breath they'd been holding. Then, "The demonstration is still running. 40 minutes in. It's working. Good. Come back when you can. There's no rush." A pause. "Tell her, I don't know. Tell her she was brave." He looked at Emma, who had her chin on his shoulder now, looking back down the corridor with the expression of someone cataloging an experience for future reference. "She knows," he said. Back at the Nexora building, the second part of the day began to unfold with the specific momentum of events that have been building for longer than anyone realized. Torres's team had been coordinating with law enforcement from the moment they'd entered the building, and the two individuals in room 312 were in police custody before Liam and Emma had gotten back into a car. Both had known connections to a private security contractor that had, in turn, been retained. The legal team established this by evening by a senior vice president at Meridian Systems. The Meridian thread was longer and more complex than a single vice president, and it would take weeks to fully document. But by the end of the demonstration day, the outline was clear. Meridian had identified Nexora's internal vulnerabilities through Richard Voss, cultivated the three internal bad actors, including Dale Pruitt, over a period of months with financial incentives, and when the internal sabotage had failed, when Liam had fixed the system from the ground up, and Victoria had moved to clean house, they'd escalated to the Emma Gambit as a last resort. A desperate move that had the specific character of people who understood they were running out of options. Victoria stood in front of the demonstration room's assembled guests at the end of the presentation and delivered the closing remarks she'd prepared, which talked about infrastructure integrity and enterprise reliability and the future of distributed systems. She said it all well. She meant most of it. What she was thinking about, underneath the prepared remarks, was the moment Liam had put the phone in front of her face and she'd seen Emma in that photograph, the blue cardigan, the backpack, the child's complete unawareness of what surrounded her, and felt, with a clarity that surprised her by its specificity, that this was not abstract. This was not a corporate problem. This was a 7-year-old girl in a room 6 blocks away, and everything else, the investors, the journalists, the billion-dollar demonstration, all of it, was secondary in a way she hadn't expected to feel so immediately and completely. She finished the presentation. The room applauded. 3 investors approached her immediately afterward to discuss terms. She handled it all, professionally and completely. And then she went downstairs to the operations center and found Liam there, Emma asleep on a folded-up jacket in the corner of the break room, curled on the small couch with her backpack as a pillow, and Liam at his workstation running post-demonstration analysis with the specific focused stillness of a man who needed something concrete to do with his hands while the adrenaline finished working its way out of his system. She sat down at the adjacent workstation and didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't either. The server hum was the same as always, 68 degrees, constant, indifferent. "The demonstration numbers," he said eventually, without looking up. "Final performance metrics. The system hit 152% of projected enterprise load capacity, in a live environment, not staged." "Good," she said. "The routing protocol didn't drop a single packet. 600 simultaneous access simulations, 40 minutes of live operation, not one dropped packet." "Good," she said again. "Sophie's architecture," he said. "That's what that is. The efficiency that made it possible, it's in the foundational structure. What I built is a fix on top of a foundation. The foundation is hers." She looked at the side of his face, at the exhaustion in it, and something else underneath the exhaustion. Not happiness, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something like the particular feeling you get when a thing you've been fighting for a long time finally becomes real. "I know," she said. "I want her name in the official launch materials. Tomorrow, before any press release goes out. It'll be there." He turned and looked at her then, directly. His eyes were tired and clear, and the look in them was something she'd been learning to read over the past week. The look of a person who has decided, against their own better-trained caution, to trust something. "Thank you," he said, "for today, for not letting me—" He stopped. "For keeping the demonstration running. You saved the demonstration. You saved it twice, actually, if we're counting." Emma didn't save herself. "No, you did that." She held his gaze. "You did both, Liam. Same as you've been doing for years. She looked for the right phrasing. "I just finally showed up to help." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked toward the break room, where Emma was asleep with her backpack as a pillow, visible through the glass partition. "She's going to have questions," he said. "When she wakes up. She's 7. She's not going to let today go without a full accounting." "What are you going to tell her?" He was quiet for a second. "The truth. Age-appropriate version, that some bad people tried to use her to get what they wanted, and that she was brave, and that it's over." He paused. "And that people helped. That we weren't alone." Victoria looked at the glass partition, at the small, sleeping shape of a kid in a blue cardigan who had been through a genuinely frightening thing and had stood on a chair and held her backpack like a shield and told her captors she didn't like peanut butter. "She'll be okay," Victoria said. And she meant it, not as comfort, not as a thing you say, but as an actual assessment of the specific person sleeping in the break room. "Yeah," Liam said. He looked back at his screen. "She's tougher than she looks. She has her father's stubbornness." He almost smiled. Almost. "Don't say that like it's a compliment. I meant it as one." The servers hummed. The diagnostics ran. Outside, Chicago was doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, enormous. And in the break room of the Nexora Operations Center, a 7-year-old girl slept through the end of the most important day of her father's professional life, with her chin tucked against her backpack and her school uniform still perfectly buttoned, dreaming whatever children dream after they've been frightened and found and held. Liam kept working. Victoria stayed. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and the quiet was the kind that doesn't need filling. Emma woke up 40 minutes later, disoriented the way children get when they fall asleep somewhere unfamiliar and wake up somewhere that doesn't match the last place they remember being. She sat up on the small break room couch, looked at the glass partition, looked at the server room beyond it, looked at her backpack on the floor, and then looked at her father through the glass with the specific expression of a child assembling a sequence of events that doesn't quite add up yet. Liam was at his workstation. He saw her wake up and was through the break room door in about 6 seconds. "Hey, Bug. This is your work," she said. Not a question. Recognition. She'd been here once before, 2 years ago, when a babysitter had canceled and he'd had no other option, and she'd sat at the break room table for 4 hours, drawing pictures and asking the other technicians questions about the servers until Diane had declared her exhausting but impressive. "Yeah." She looked around. "Victoria's here?" He paused. "She's upstairs." "How do you know who Victoria is?" "You said her name on the phone when you were telling me to look out the window." Emma rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. "She's the boss of your work?" "She's the CEO of the company." Emma processed this. "Why is the CEO of your company helping?" It was, Liam thought, an excellent question. The kind that cut through everything adults spent enormous energy elaborating around. "Because she's a good person," he said, and understood as he said it that he meant it without qualification, which was not a position he'd expected to arrive at 2 weeks ago. Emma seemed to accept this. She picked up her backpack, checked its contents with the methodical thoroughness she applied to all inventories, and then looked at him. "Are we in trouble still?" "No, it's over." She looked at him the way she always looked at him when she was deciding whether she believed something. She had Sophie's eyes and Sophie's evaluative intelligence behind them, and it had the same effect on him at 7 that it had when Sophie did it at 28, a feeling of being very accurately read. "Okay," she said. She stood up and tugged her cardigan straight. "Can we get food? I'm really hungry. That granola bar was terrible." He took her to the Thai place 2 blocks from the building, which was where Victoria had eaten alone 2 nights ago, though neither of them knew that yet. They sat at a table near the window, and Emma ordered pad thai with the authority of a child who knows exactly what she likes and has stopped being shy about saying so, and Liam ordered whatever the specials were without reading the description because he was too tired to make food decisions. They ate mostly in silence, which was comfortable rather than strained. Emma was processing the day in the way she processed things, internally, thoroughly, at her own pace. He watched her work through the noodles and knew that the questions would come when she was ready and not before, and that they would be exactly the right questions, and that he would answer them as truthfully as a parent can answer an 8-year-old's questions about why the world contains people who use children as leverage in corporate conspiracies. The question, when it came, was not the one he expected. "Dad, those men in the room, were they scared of you?" He looked up. "What do you mean?" "Like," she searched for the phrasing. "They seemed nervous. Before the loud part happened, one of them kept looking at his phone a lot." She speared a piece of tofu. "I think they were scared it wasn't going to work." He looked at his daughter, at the careful intelligence in her face, the observation she'd made while sitting in a room with two armed men, reading them the way another child might have just been scared, reading them while also not liking the granola bar, filing it all away. "Yeah," he said. "I think they were scared too." "Why?" "Because they were trying to force someone to do something, and when you're trying to force someone, you're not sure it's going to work, which means you're scared." He paused. "Scared people make bad decisions." She thought about this. "Is that why they took me? Because they made a bad decision?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Okay," and went back to her pad thai, apparently satisfied with the structural logic of it, which was the most Emma response to a harrowing experience he could have imagined. He paid the bill and walked her home through the cold evening, her hand in his, and she asked him 3 more questions on the way. Whether the servers in his building were louder than she remembered, whether Victoria was tall or short in person, and whether it was true that octopuses could open jars, which she'd read about and found implausible. He answered all 3. She seemed satisfied. At the apartment, Mrs. Kowalski was waiting with the specific energy of a woman who had received a phone call earlier that she was still processing, and she held Emma for a long moment and then held Liam for a shorter one and said, in the thick Polish-American accent she'd never fully smoothed out in 40 years of Chicago living, "You are both okay. Good. Now eat something. You look terrible." He told her he'd just eaten. She didn't believe him and made him a sandwich anyway. The weeks that followed moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. The speed of legal and institutional processes, which was slow and bureaucratic and full of documents, and the speed of actual life, which kept going regardless. The legal proceedings against Dale Pruitt, Gareth Cole, and Kim Park were handled through a combination of civil and criminal processes. Pruitt's financial connection to Meridian Systems was established within 2 weeks of the demonstration. Payments routed through a consulting LLC he'd set up 3 years prior, amounting to slightly over $400,000 across 18 months. Cole had been paid significantly less. Kim Park's legal team argued cooperation from the start, and she provided testimony that filled in several gaps in the communication timeline. The criminal charges took months to fully process, as criminal charges do, moving through the system at the speed of the system. Richard Voss resigned before he could be formally terminated, which was the move of a man who understood corporate dynamics well enough to know that a resignation preserved certain things a termination didn't. It didn't preserve his reputation, which the investigation's findings eventually made public in a way that was thorough and, in Liam's assessment, entirely proportionate. Voss's connection to Meridian was more complex than a simple bribe. He'd been promised an executive role at Meridian after what he'd expected to be Nexora's public failure, a failure he'd been positioned to help engineer over 11 years of building internal access and influence. It was the kind of long-game betrayal that required a specific character to sustain, and Liam tried not to think about how many board meetings and strategy sessions and internal trust-building conversations had been part of the cover. The Meridian Systems investigation was referred to federal authorities and took on a life entirely its own, which is what federal investigations do. The SVP at Meridian, who had authorized the Emma Gambit, was arrested 6 weeks after the demonstration. 2 other Meridian executives were named in the subsequent indictment. The company's stock dropped 31% in 1 week and never fully recovered. Liam followed all of this the way you follow something that involves you but is no longer yours to manage, with attention and a certain distance, the way you watch a storm from inside a building after the windows are shut. What he was managing in those weeks was everything else. The official attribution of Sophie's work happened faster than he'd expected. Victoria moved on it with the same qualities she brought to most things, not impulsive, but direct, without the institutional delay that usually attended decisions of that kind. Within 10 days of the demonstration, Nexora's technical documentation for the Helix platform was formally amended to include Sophie Bennett as a contributing architect, specifically crediting the foundational load distribution concepts that Liam had documented in the composition notebooks. The amendment was written by an independent technical expert, Sophie's former graduate professor, who had been waiting for exactly this call. and it was precise and unambiguous and cited the time-stamped notebooks as primary evidence. When Liam read the final amendment, sitting at his kitchen table at midnight while Emma slept, he sat with it for a long time. He read Sophie's name in the formal document, Sophie R. Bennett, contributing architect, and the specific technical language of what she'd built, described accurately for the first time by people with the standing to make it official. He thought about the composition notebooks with their left-tilted handwriting, about the ideas inside them that had traveled from a desk in their old apartment through a 6-month consulting contract into the infrastructure of a billion-dollar system, uncredited, for 3 years. He thought about the fact that Emma would be able to read this someday, that there would be a document, permanent and formal, that told Emma what her mother had built. He closed the laptop and went to check on Emma, because that was what you did with feelings you couldn't contain. You redirected them toward the person they were ultimately for. She was asleep on her stomach with one arm hanging off the bed and the marine biology book open on the pillow beside her, which told him she'd been reading until she dropped. He picked the book up and set it on the nightstand. He straightened her blanket. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark and the quiet, and then he went back to the kitchen and sat down again and let himself feel, without management or redirection, the specific weight of something owed finally being paid. It wasn't enough. It would never be entirely enough. But it was real, and it was official, and it had Sophie's name on it. That meant something. The Sophie Bennett Innovation Foundation was announced 8 weeks after the demonstration, at a company event that Victoria had organized with the same directness she'd applied to the attribution amendment. The foundation was funded at $5 million, a number Victoria had proposed, and the board had approved without the argument she'd prepared for. And its stated purpose was to support early career engineers from underrepresented backgrounds, specifically in distributed systems and infrastructure architecture. The selection criteria included a particular emphasis on engineers who had demonstrated exceptional work in environments where that work had gone unrecognized. Liam had not asked for the foundation. Victoria had come to him with it 3 weeks after the demonstration, sitting across from him in the conference room where they'd been working through the remaining investigation materials, and she'd described what she had in mind with the same precision and absence of performance she brought to most things she meant. He'd looked at her for a moment. "That's a lot of money," he said. "It's the right amount. You went to the board without asking me. I wanted to have board approval before I brought it to you because I didn't want to promise you something I wasn't certain I could deliver." She held his gaze. "I knew what the answer would be. I just needed to make it official first." He was quiet for a moment. Sophie would think it was too much. Sophie sounds like she was wrong about some things. He almost laughed. Yeah, she was. He looked at the table. She used to undervalue herself systematically. It made me insane. A pause. She'd have known the foundation was right, though, eventually. She'd have gotten there. Then get there on her behalf. He looked up. "Say yes," Victoria said. "Let the foundation exist. Let her name do something in the world." She leaned forward slightly. She built something that runs a billion-dollar platform. A foundation named for her that supports engineers who are where she was. That's proportionate. That's not too much. He said yes. The foundation's first cohort of grant recipients was announced 4 months later. Liam was on the selection committee. He read every application himself, which was not required. There were professional reviewers, a structured process, but which he did anyway, in the evenings after Emma was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the composition notebook sometimes open beside him, not consulting them exactly, just having them present. He was looking for something specific in the applications, though he didn't articulate it this way until much later. He was looking for the engineers who were doing exceptional work in the places where exceptional work went unremarked, who were building things in the basement while the credit went upstairs, who had developed the particular discipline of people who do the right thing without an audience, because the work itself requires it regardless of whether anyone is watching. He found them. There were more of them than he'd expected, which was either encouraging or depressing depending on how you looked at it. And he chose to look at it as encouraging because the alternative was not productive. Emma met Victoria for the first time properly, not counting the break room glimpse through the glass partition, approximately 3 weeks after the demonstration, when Victoria came to the apartment to drop off a set of documents for Liam's signature and stayed for dinner because it was 6:30, and Emma, who had been doing homework at the kitchen table, looked up from her worksheet and said, with the unfiltered directness of a 7-year-old, "You should eat with us. We're having pasta." Victoria looked at Liam. Liam looked at his daughter. "That's not really how you invite someone to dinner." "I know." Emma looked back at Victoria. "But do you want to stay? There's a lot. Dad always makes too much." "He does?" Victoria said. "He learned to cook for 2 adults, and he forgets I'm little. We have leftovers all the time." Emma turned back to her worksheet. "So, do you want to stay?" Victoria stayed. She sat at the kitchen table with Emma while Liam finished the pasta, and Emma explained her homework to her, a worksheet on ecosystems that Emma had opinions about, specifically regarding the section on ocean ecosystems, which she felt was too short. And Victoria engaged with this with an attention that was not performed, that was genuinely interested, which Emma detected immediately because children detect that distinction faster than adults give them credit for. "The worksheet only has 4 ocean ecosystems," Emma said. "But there's way more. Hydrothermal vents are an ecosystem, kelp forests, open ocean. The worksheet is incomplete." "Did you tell your teacher that?" "I wrote a note in the margin." Victoria looked at Liam across the kitchen. He was stirring pasta and not looking at either of them, which was his way of managing the expression on his face that he didn't want to have to explain. "What did your teacher say?" Victoria asked. "She said I was right, but that the worksheet was designed for 3rd grade curriculum standards, and I should write a bonus response if I wanted to cover the additional ecosystems." "Are you going to?" Emma considered this. "Yeah. I'm going to do hydrothermal vents. They're weird. Nothing should be able to live there, and things do anyway." "That is weird," Victoria agreed. "And interesting." Emma looked at her appraisingly. "You know about hydrothermal vents?" "A little. I studied economics, not biology, but I read." "Dad reads too," Emma said. "He's the only person I know who actually reads the whole book and not just part of it." "That's a specific thing to know about someone." "I notice things," Emma said simply, and went back to her worksheet. Dinner was not elegant. The pasta was slightly overcooked because Liam had been distracted. The kitchen table was too small for 3 people with the homework and the papers still on it, and at one point Emma knocked her water glass and it went across the table and soaked a stack of documents that fortunately were copies rather than originals. Victoria helped mop it up with paper towels, working efficiently alongside Emma with zero drama about the wet documents, which Liam noted with the specific attention he gave to how people behaved when things went wrong unexpectedly. After dinner, Emma showed Victoria the marine biology book. All of it, not selected highlights, the whole thing, page by page, providing commentary on what she found interesting and what she felt the author had gotten wrong. Victoria sat on the couch and listened to all of it with what appeared to be genuine patience and what Liam suspected was also genuine interest, because Victoria was a person who had never had the time to think much about marine biology, and now found herself thinking about it in the company of a 7-year-old who knew more about it than most adults. He washed the dishes and watched them through the kitchen doorway and felt something he had no immediate name for. Something quiet and complicated, the way feelings are when they're composed of several things at once, gratitude and protectiveness, and a kind of careful, aware hope that he was not ready to examine directly yet, only peripherally, the way you look at something bright by looking slightly to the side of it. Victoria left at 8:30 when it became clear that Emma was fighting sleep in the specific way of children who don't want an interesting evening to end. She stood at the door with her coat on and said goodnight to Emma, who said goodnight back with the tone of someone who had already decided to continue the marine biology conversation at a future date. When the door closed, Emma looked at her father. "I like her," she said. "Yeah?" "She listened to the whole book. Some people pretend to listen, but you can tell." Emma headed toward the bathroom to brush her teeth. She actually listened. He stood in the hallway and listened to the water run and thought about that. About the difference between pretending to pay attention and actually paying it. About how children and servers, in his experience, both required that you actually show up rather than perform showing up. That you couldn't fake either. His new title, Director of Infrastructure Integrity, came with an office. An actual office with a door and a window and enough square footage to hold a desk and 2 chairs without anyone feeling crowded. He'd spent the first 2 days in it sitting slightly wrong, the way you do in a space that doesn't yet feel like yours. He'd put Sophie's composition notebooks on the shelf. He'd put the plastic dinosaur on the desk. He'd found a new piece of masking tape and put Emma's photograph on the monitor. Marcus knocked on his door the third day and stood in the doorway looking at the space with an expression that was genuinely difficult to decode. Marcus had been promoted too, a formal recognition of his role on the night of the crisis, and in the weeks following, a senior technician designation that came with a pay adjustment and a seat at the infrastructure planning table. He'd accepted it with approximately 4 words and gone back to work, which was how Marcus handled most things. "It's weird seeing your name on a door," Marcus said. "It's weird having my name on a door. You deserve it. You deserve yours too." Marcus shrugged, which was not disagreement exactly, more the shrug of a person who doesn't know how to accept a thing directly and so acknowledges it sideways. He looked at the notebooks on the shelf. "Those are hers? Your wife's?" "Yeah." He nodded. He looked at the dinosaur on the desk. He didn't say anything else for a moment, and then, "The subroutine you built. I've been studying it. I think there's an extension possible, a parallel processing application that uses the same load redistribution logic, but applied to multi-cluster environments." Liam looked at him. "You figured that out from reading it?" "I've been reading it for 3 weeks. Marcus looked slightly defensive. "I'm not as fast as you." "I didn't say that." Liam turned to his computer. "Show me what you have." Marcus came in, sat in the second chair, and pulled up his laptop. They worked for 2 hours, which was how they most naturally communicated. Not the talking kind of conversation, mostly, but the working kind. The back and forth of one person seeing what another person is building and understanding instinctively where it's going and either following it or pushing back. What Marcus had found was real. It wasn't finished. There were gaps in the logic he hadn't resolved yet, which Marcus acknowledged with a precision that Liam had always respected. But the skeleton of it was sound. The extension would make the architecture applicable to multi-cluster environments in a way that hadn't been possible before, which meant it would make Helix applicable to a category of enterprise client that was currently out of scope. "You should bring this to the architecture team," Liam said. "I wanted to show you first." Liam looked at him. "In case it was wrong," Marcus said. "It's not wrong. I know that now." Marcus closed his laptop. "But I wanted to know before I walked it into a room full of people." Liam understood this completely, and without any explanation. The specific vulnerability of bringing a good idea somewhere before you're certain it's a good idea. The particular need to have someone you trust tell you it's real before you risk it in front of people who might not see it. "It's real," Liam said. "Bring it in." Diane retired 2 months after the demonstration. She did it the way she'd done most things, without announcement or ceremony, informing Liam on a Tuesday that she was putting in her notice and that the 22 years she'd spent in the operations center had been, on balance, a reasonable use of her time. She shook Liam's hand when she left, which from Diane was roughly equivalent to a formal declaration of respect, and told him not to let the new hires leave food in the monitoring room because the smell got into the server filters. He promised. She left. The room was different without her size, and he hadn't expected that, and it took about 2 weeks to adjust to the difference. The Emma situation, the formal official resolution of all things related to Emma's medical care, took the form of a comprehensive benefits package that Victoria had worked with HR and legal to build specifically, which was not normal corporate procedure and which the HR director had flagged as creating precedent concerns. Victoria had listened to the precedent concerns and then instructed HR to ensure that the benefits package for all employees adequately covered dependent medical care at a level that meant no parent in the company was making the decisions Liam had been making in the 18 months before he resigned. The precedent, she'd told the HR director, was the point. Emma's treatment protocol was adjusted in month 2. The procedure the specialist had recommended completed in month 3. The recovery was not comfortable. Emma was irritable and bored and adamant that the prescribed rest period was excessive. But it was straightforward. The specialist called the outcome excellent in the carefully non-committal language of specialists who have learned not to promise things they can't control, but said it with the tone of a person who is closer to certain than they are allowed to say. Emma spent her recovery period finishing the marine biology book, completing the bonus ecosystem response for school, which ran to 7 pages and included her own illustrations, and teaching herself to properly braid her own hair, which she achieved on a Sunday afternoon with the focused concentration of someone solving a technical problem, emerging from her room with both braids even and tight, and standing in the kitchen doorway waiting for Liam to notice. He noticed. "Both sides," he said. "Both sides," she confirmed. He looked at her. He thought about the photograph, held to the monitor with masking tape, the edge peeling, the yellow raincoat 2 sizes too big, the fountain in Riverside Park. "Your mom would have loved this," he said. He didn't say it often. He was careful with it, the way you're careful with things that are real and irreplaceable. She spent 2 hours on her own hair every morning. Emma touched one of the braids. Was she good at it? She was great at it. She could do complicated ones, the kind I can't even name. Emma processed this. Maybe Aunt Rena can show me. She knows how to do the complicated ones. "We'll call her." Emma nodded, satisfied. Then, "Is Victoria coming for dinner on Friday?" He looked up from the counter where he'd been starting dinner prep. "She hasn't. I haven't asked her yet." "You should ask her." Emma went to the kitchen table and opened her backpack. "She said she wanted to hear about my bonus response. I finished it." "She said that?" "Last time. When she was here." Emma pulled out the 7-page report with its hand-drawn illustrations, slightly crumpled at one corner. "She asked about it. She remembered I was working on it." He stood at the counter and thought about the quality of attention required to ask a 7-year-old, 2 weeks later, about a bonus report on ocean ecosystems. The specific effort of remembering something that had no bearing on your work or your schedule or anything other than the fact that a child had told you about it and you'd listened. He called Victoria that evening. She picked up on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless, the sound of someone stepping out of something to take the call. "Sorry, I was in a thing. What is it?" Emma finished her bonus ecosystem report. She wants to show you on Friday. A pause. He could hear her smile in it. "What time?" 7 works. I'll be there." He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then he went back to making dinner, and the apartment was warm around him, smelling of garlic and onion. And from Emma's room he could hear her practicing the names of deep-sea organisms with the specific, repetitive dedication of a child memorizing something she's decided is important. Friday arrived the way Fridays do at the end of a week that has taken something from you and given something back, with a tiredness that is not unpleasant because it comes from having actually done things, said things, moved through the world, and left small marks on it. Liam cooked a real dinner, not pasta this time, something that required more attention, and he set the table with the plates that weren't the everyday ones, which he then second-guessed and switched back to the everyday ones because the non-everyday plates felt like a statement he wasn't sure he was ready to make. Victoria arrived at 7 with a bottle of wine he told her she didn't need to bring, and she'd brought anyway, and a small paper bag that she set on the counter without explaining. Emma was at the door before he finished getting there, the ecosystem report in hand. "I have 7 pages, Emma announced. "I know," Victoria said. "Let me take my coat off first." "Okay." Emma stood and visibly waited for the coat removal to complete. Victoria looked at Liam over Emma's head with an expression that was managing amusement and something warmer at the same time. He took her coat. They ate dinner and Emma presented her report, which she had approached with the organizational rigor of someone who had understood that a presentation is different from a conversation. She had an order. She had the illustrations. She talked about hydrothermal vents for 6 minutes, with an authority that would have been impressive in an adult scientist, and was genuinely remarkable in an 8-year-old. And Victoria asked 2 questions that were good enough questions that Emma paused and thought before answering them, which was the highest compliment Emma's engagement system offered. After dinner, after Emma had been sent to brush her teeth, and the 3rd attempt to extend the evening had been gently declined, and she'd finally gone to bed under the marine biology book and her own patient illustrations, Liam and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with the wine and the comfortable kind of quiet that had become, over the months, one of the things he didn't expect but had come to value. The paper bag she'd brought was still on the counter. He hadn't asked about it. "What's in the bag?" he said. She got up and got it and set it on the table between them. Inside was a framed photograph, not large, the kind that fits on a desk or a shelf. He picked it up. It was Sophie's attribution amendment. The official one, the document from Nixor's technical record, Sophie R. Bennett's name, and the precise language of what she'd contributed, framed in plain wood, without sentiment, just the document itself, made permanent. He looked at it for a long time. "I thought you might want one," Victoria said, "for the office, or here, wherever." He looked at the frame, at Sophie's name in the formal language of official recognition, the kind that didn't go away, the kind that existed in the record regardless of what happened to any individual person, the kind that Emma would be able to find someday, in the company record and in whatever historical documentation followed it, and read and know. "Thank you," he said. He set it on the table and looked at it. "This is—" He stopped, started again. She would have pretended it was no big deal. "But it is." "Yeah." He looked up. "It is." Victoria looked at him with the directness she'd always had, the quality that had made him trust her in the first place. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was honest. "How are you, actually?" It was the kind of question most people asked without wanting the actual answer. He'd learned over the past months that she wanted the actual answer. "Tired," he said. "Good tired, mostly. The kind that comes from things actually happening rather than things being held still." He turned the wine glass. "Emma is better. The foundation is running. The legal stuff is moving through its process, and I've mostly stopped waiting for the next thing to go wrong, which is an improvement." He paused. "Marcus is presenting his extension to the architecture team next week. It's going to be good." "I know. He showed me the preliminary framework." "He showed you?" "He came to my office." She smiled slightly. "Apparently he wanted a second opinion before the architecture team." Liam shook his head. "He never mentioned that." "He's private," she shrugged. "He's also right. The extension is genuinely good." "Yeah." He looked at the framed document. Sophie would have liked Marcus. She had no patience for people who were impressed by their own ideas. Marcus is the opposite. He doesn't trust his ideas enough. There should be a name for the space between those two failures. "Calibration," he said. Sophie called it calibration, knowing accurately how good the idea is without either ego or doubt pulling the number. He paused. "She was good at it. Better than me." "You're pretty well calibrated," Victoria said. "I second-guess myself constantly." "That's not miscalibration. That's checking your work." He looked at her. She was sitting across the kitchen table from him in the apartment where he'd lived for 4 years, in the chair Emma usually sat in for homework, with Sophie's framed attribution between them and the winter quiet outside the window and the small sounds of a child settling into sleep down the hall. She looked like herself, not the 40th floor version, not the press conference version, not the version that appeared in business publications looking precisely composed. Just herself, at the end of a Friday, tired in the good way, honest in the way she was when she wasn't performing anything. "I switched the plates back," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "When I was setting the table, I got out the good plates, and then I switched back to the regular ones." He wasn't sure why he was telling her this. "I didn't want to—" He stopped. "Make a statement," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment. "The regular plates were fine." "I know." "Liam." She said it the way she said things she meant completely. "I'm here because I want to be here. Not because of the company, not because of the case, not because of anything except—" She gestured at the kitchen, at the apartment, at the whole improbable situation. "This. Whatever this is." He looked at her across the table, at the woman who had shown up at his door at 9:30 at night in a city of 3 million people because she'd watched security footage of a man fixing a billion-dollar system and decided it wasn't right that nobody knew his name. Who had sat in his server room and listened to him negotiate broccoli over the phone, who had stayed when Emma was asleep in the break room, not because there was work left to do, but because leaving hadn't felt like the right thing. "I know," he said. "I know why you're here. Good. I'm still figuring out—" He paused. "I'm careful. With Emma. With all of it." "I know you are." She wasn't impatient with this. She never was, which was itself something. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are." He looked at his hands. At the kitchen table where Emma did her homework and ate her dinners and conducted her ecosystem presentations. At the shelf in the living room where the composition notebooks were stacked. At the door where the small pink sneakers with Velcro straps still lived, because Emma had declared them her inside shoes, and he hadn't argued. "Stay for a bit," he said. "If you don't have anywhere to be." "I don't have anywhere to be?" "Okay." She stayed. They talked, and they didn't talk. And outside, the snow that had been threatening all day finally made up its mind and started coming down. The quiet kind. The kind that muffles everything and makes the city outside seem like it's been dialed down a register. The kitchen light was warm. The apartment was warm. Down the hall, Emma slept with her braids even and her ecosystem report on the nightstand. There is a thing that happens sometimes in a life. Not often, not on schedule, not because you planned it or earned it in any calculable way. A specific arrangement of people in a space late in an evening, with the snow outside and the ordinary furniture and the ordinary dinner plates, and none of it performing anything, just existing. Where what's been lost hasn't been replaced but has been, not surrounded exactly, but accompanied. Where the people sitting at the table are not the people you expected to be sitting there and are also, somehow, exactly the people who should be. It isn't a resolution in the way stories resolve. It's not a conclusion that answers everything. It's a specific kind of okay, fragile in the way real things are fragile, built not on certainty but on the decision, made daily, to keep showing up for the people in front of you. Liam had spent 6 years keeping a company's infrastructure running in the dark, without credit, without acknowledgement, for the photograph held to the monitor with failing tape. He had walked away when the cost of staying became the cost of Emma's future. He had come back, not because the company deserved it, but because the work did, and because someone had finally asked him to, clearly and honestly, without the performance of fairness, but with the actual thing. He had learned, in the process, something he'd known in theory, but now understood the way you understand things that cost you something to learn. That the people who hold things together are rarely the people who get credit for it. That the infrastructure of anything, a company, a family, a life, is almost always maintained by someone working below the floor that everyone else stands on. That the right thing to do about that is not to accept it as permanent, but to change it, specifically one person at a time, in the places where you have the standing to change it. Sophie had built something that ran $1 billion system, and nobody had put her name on it. Now they had. It was too late, and it was also real, and both of those things were true simultaneously and always would be. Emma was going to grow up knowing what her mother had built. She was going to grow up in a family that looked nothing like the one she'd been born into, and everything like the one her father had made possible, through stubbornness and documentation and the refusal to stay invisible, even when invisibility would have been easier. She was going to grow up watched by a woman who had listened to 7 pages about hydrothermal vents and asked good questions, and who would keep asking them, because that was the kind of person she was. Outside, the snow came down. The city was quiet under it. Inside, the light was warm. That was enough. That was, in fact, the whole thing.